So,
Okay, go ahead.
good evening, everyone. Today is I'm sorry, today is March the 31st, 2020, and we're all practicing safe social distance protocols, and we're all, as you can see, in our respective places, some of us in our office, some of us in our homes, but rest assured we are all safe, and we're hoping the same for you. The other thing I wanted to do is thank everyone for indulging us. We're learning how to use this technology in light of this unprecedented set of circumstances. And I would dare say, I think we're leading the way in Rochester. A lot of organizations, particularly public service organizations, aren't ahead of the game as we are in terms of communicating this manner. And we don't get too many opportunities to take pride as a district in terms of what we do, but in this respect, we're doing it well. And this is not by accident. Thanks to prior superintendents, Anne Marie, who is now our chief of staff, they have been working on this communications department. People who are still employed and people who have since left are part of our capacity, are the reason why we're capable of doing this stuff as we do it right now, which basically allows people to have access to government despite this unprecedented set of circumstances. And let me tell you, this is meaningful. People may roll their eyes and say, oh, it's just government as usual. This is not government as usual, because check this out, and our clerk will confirm this. We had 700 people checking us out last week. And that was between YouTube and what else, Madam Clerk?
YouTube and Facebook Live.
YouTube and Facebook Live. 700 people watching our proceedings. And that's something that we can take pride of, because that's open government at its best in a very difficult set of circumstances. So before we begin, I want to thank those folks, those 700 plus folks that watched their government in operation and all of its perfection and imperfection. We appreciate your interest in what we're doing here. I'm going to call this meeting to order, and as our bylaws do require, not something that I'm doing because I want to do it, although I've been doing it since I was a kid in grade school. I happen to have my own flag here, and we're going to invite those who want to participate. Pledge of Allegiance. So stand up here in my office, and if you want to stand up, that's fine, but if you want to recite it with me, that's cool as well. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Now, I heard one or two board members trying to go along with that. We'll have to figure that process kind of choppy, but we'll figure that out. Thank you for participating. You know, I'm not going to repeat the long commentary I made. I would just ask that folks reflect upon those folks that are struggling with COVID-19. Every day we're finding and hearing different stories personally and as an arm of government, how people are struggling through these very difficult challenges. I know some of you, and I personally, I have family members who have been diagnosed with the virus. So our prayers are with, and by the way, many of us know people that are shut in that we can't get to. So as always, this Board of Education sends its prayers and positive thoughts to those that are struggling to figure out something that nobody's ever had to figure out before. So please continue to hold those people in your thoughts and prayers. Next item on the agenda is the speakers list. Madam Clerk, do we have anybody?
Yes, President White, we have 13 people who submitted comments for this evening's meeting.
Well, I think since that seems to be a manageable amount, and I got a lot of positive feedback about the reading of the statements from each of those individuals. I haven't gotten any direction from the board to the contrary. 13 seems to be a reasonable amount. So if you wouldn't mind, could you read those 13 statements? And again, in new business, if the board wants to suggest that we do something different going forward or set a cap, we can discuss that at new business, or offline, people can call the clerk up and make their suggestions directly to the clerk.
I want everyone watching to be aware that I am reading the comments as they were submitted to us via the Board of Education at rcsdk12.org. If you are interested in submitting comments, that is the way to do it. Please note that you have to provide your name, your affiliation, your phone number, and your comments. We will not be reading any anonymous comments that we receive. One more note is I've seen some comments about my Christmas tree in the background. Yes, I did keep it up. Yes, I lit it again. It brings me joy, and I hope it brings you joy as well. So our first speaker is Dahlia, who is a student from RIA. I really want RIA to be open forever. RIA is a great school for learning. Our teachers at RIA are nice, kind, and helpful. RIA is like our second home for me and maybe the others. There are no schools that are like RIA. I want to keep learning at RIA. RIA is a special place in my heart. Please don't close RIA next year or in any year. The second comment comes from Michele Simms, who is a parent, and her topic is social workers. As a parent of regular education students, my son would not have made it as far as he was without the continuous support of our school's social worker. Please do not cut the social worker positions. The next comment comes from Bethany Carrion, who is a parent, and her topic is special education. Hello, my name is Bethany Carrion. I'm a parent of a student with special needs in 12th grade, senior class 2020. Holla. I'm also the parent of a special needs student in 9th grade. I heard something so disturbing, it absolutely does not sit well with my soul. I heard the budget request that Keisha Morgan, head of special ed, steps down into an executive position, and that she will no longer be the head of special ed. I am appalled if this is true, and every one of you should be ashamed of yourselves for even considering this. Keisha Morgan is the sole reason why my senior is graduating. Other than Dan Fontanez and Amy Tata, who work under her, Keisha is prayers answered by almost every parent who has a child in sixth grade or higher. As we know, certain people did not do their jobs. Do not take parents backwards. We will fight for Keisha. You can guarantee petitions, pitchforks, and protests. We go hard for her, just as Keisha goes hard for us. Not that others in the department don't. They are true soldiers also, but apparently Keisha's hard work, blood, and so our parents and students, we will not go backwards, period, and God bless. The next comment is from Jessica Hammond, a community member, and her comments are regarding the City School District 2021 budget. As a member of the Rochester community and a strong supporter of the Rochester City School District, I ask that this state budget, you provide the district with $35 million in funding to help close their budget deficit this year. We are still trying to recover from mid-year cuts and layoffs. This funding is necessary to minimize cuts at a time when our students and families need our schools the most. I also ask that the much needed fiscal monitor for the Rochester City School District be appointed by a neutral party, such as the Commissioner of the State Education Department, as opposed to a stakeholder in this process, such as the mayor of the City of Rochester. I am a special education teacher in the City of Rochester School District. These cuts will directly impact me and my job security. I am a third-year teacher. I have worked in the same school for 3 years. I have worked with many of the same students for 3 years. Losing my job will not just impact my life, but also my students, as they need stability and consistency in their lives. They were already impacted by mid-year cuts. Please don't change their lives for the worse again. Thank you for your consideration and concern on this urgent matter. The next public comment is from Kaylee Caswell, a community member, and her comments are regarding the 2021 school budget. My name is Kaylee Caswell. As a member of the Rochester community and a strong supporter of the Rochester City School District, I ask that in this state budget, you provide the district with $35 million in funding to help close their budget deficit this year. We are still trying to recover from mid-year cuts and layoffs. This funding is necessary to minimize cuts at a time when our students and family needs our school the most. I ask that the much needed fiscal monitor for the Rochester City School District be appointed by a neutral party, such as the Commissioner of State Education, as opposed to a stakeholder in the process, such as the mayor of the city of Rochester. I teach special education in the city school district, and the mid-year cuts have directly impacted me in many ways. My entire schedule was changed, causing me to lose all rapport I had established in the first half of the year, left to start over in January. Students with disabilities usually have the most difficult time adapting to change in schedule, teachers, and expectations. And I know for a fact that my students were hit hard by these changes. If we are not given the funding that we need for this year, my students will see even more change and regression. The only way to keep moving forward is to continue supporting all the students and educators. The next comment comes from Victoria Tilby, a staff member, and her comments are related to the proposed cuts to social worker and the demotion of Chief Ruth Turner. As you all know, Rochester has high poverty levels and our students have high trauma levels. The attached document that was mentioned in the budget, please refer to page 18, suggests a ratio of 1 social worker to 50 students under the aforementioned high risk, high needs condition. Please take the time to familiarize yourself with this document, as I believe it was misinterpreted in the proposed budget cuts and is important when considering cutting approximately 28% of the social work workforce at RCSD. Currently, we have around 120 social workers. A cut of 28% is around 30 social workers. A cut that large and deep wouldn't even leave enough staff to service special education students. All the extras, attendance meetings, home visits, crisis management, mental health discharge meetings, resource connection would need to be removed from our plate. Who would do this work? I am also very disheartened at the demotion of Chief Ruth Turner. Her dedication and countless hours of work to our district and to our children is unprecedented. She is a rock to staff and students alike. She has brought restorative practices to the district, allowing students to take an active role and to have a voice. She provides support and education to the community and is a strong voice for equity and the Black and Brown population in our schools. She advocates for everyone. Eliminating her voice and knowledge from the executive panel is a mistake. Where are the proposed cuts to other departments at CO? Why does HCI, placement, finance, budget, payroll, etc. go untouched? Why are much needed mental health programs for students being eliminated while cuts? I do not have all the answers, nor do I envy the position you are all in. What I do know is that our students deserve every chance at success and that the current budget proposal sorely misses that mark. Please consider the social emotional needs of our students when moving forward. Thank you. Any position related to the strategic plan for English language learner achievement and alignment. If this board can justify spending $1.5 million on security resource officers, then it surely can rationalize investing in our most vulnerable learners. The next comment comes from Dr. Gretchen Mims, a school social worker, and her comments are related to funding. Please supply the Rochester City School District with all the funds they need. Our students are the ones who suffer when cuts have to be made. Again, I am requesting that you provide all of the money that is needed to the Rochester City School District so there will be no staff cuts. Having no staff cuts will ultimately benefit our students, future teachers, and future leaders. The next comment comes from Renee Gelsomina, who is a social worker at RIA, and her comments are related to the 2021 school budget. First, I am calling attention to the part of the proposal to cut K-5 from Rochester International Academy. Due to the differentiated instruction, immersion in learning English, and support of fellow classmates that ELL students receive at RIA, this change could be devastating to the success of a young and vulnerable population. The teachers and staff at RIA provide a level of instruction and support to ELLs and newly arrived refugees that is second to none. The students also support each other through common languages and cultures. Dismantling the program as it stands would certainly be a mistake. Secondly, I'm calling attention to the part of the proposal to cut 32 social workers. I'm wondering how this would be helpful to the district long-term. School social workers provide counseling and mandated and non-mandated students, crisis intervention, counseling, connections to and relationships with the community resources, advocacy for students and families, and a trauma-informed lens from which to guide teachers and staff. Cutting social workers would surely impact that success in family engagement and trust. I urge you to think about these ideas as you consider the budget and how you will vote. Thank you for your time. The next comment comes from Cindy Begley, who is a staff member, and her comments are related to funding. I'm reaching out to you as a speech language pathologist with the Rochester City School District. I have written and called both of our senators to request their votes to provide the desperately needed $35 million in funding. I am requesting your support to use your votes to minimize cuts at a time when our students and family need our schools the most. I have witnessed the tears of kindergarten and first grade students when we suffered the loss of teachers last January. I also ask that the much needed fiscal monitor for the Rochester City School District be appointed by a neutral party, such as the Commissioner of the State Education Department, as opposed to a stakeholder in this process, such as the mayor of the city of Rochester. Thank you for your time and concern on this urgent matter. The next comment comes from Timothy Hansel. He's a staff person and his comments are related to the proposed 2020-2021 budget. Dear members of the Board of Education, I would implore you to reconsider Superintendent Dade's newly proposed budget plan for 2020-2021. This plan directly affects our most vulnerable students, the students with social-emotional needs, the students that feel often bullied and that don't belong, the students that stop attending their home schools because they are becoming more withdrawn and do not get the supports that they desperately need. As a teacher with the city school district since 2003, I have seen the district overcome many challenges. I have also witnessed students that feel they do not connect at school and do not want to be there. Many simply stop attending. When these students are recommended for programs like Young Mothers and Interim Health, and then placed there, you can see the firsthand their whole outlook change. In this smaller setting, the anxiety melts away, their personality begins to shine, and they finally feel like they belong. They start attending school. They start earning credits and even graduate. This program is a success story and should be built upon, bragged about, and not cut. In these times, how can Superintendent Dade even consider eliminating a program that works with students that have mental health challenges, suffer from major anxiety, are suicidal, are bullied at their home school, are part of the LGBTQ community, and or are pregnant? These students cannot simply just go back to their home school or to All City. I realize that the budget is a real concern, but have the following ever been discussed? Ways to save. Eliminate positions at central office based upon salary and equal proportion to the budget cuts. Teacher coaches, mentors, data teams, etc. can be eliminated. If you are not directly in front of students teaching, then your position should be reconsidered. Transportation costs. How much is spent on transportation? How much does the RCSD give to the RTS? How much would be saved with a switch to the neighborhood school model as opposed to school of choice? Reconsider how much is spent per pupil at East. Many of their most challenging students are sent to other high schools or programs. Eliminating the cost of textbooks, at least in high schools. Students now have Chromebooks, and most resources teachers are using are virtual anyways. When teachers need a resource in print, they print it. Classroom textbooks are becoming part of the past. All things should be on the table before we start eliminating programs that work or teachers that are in front of students daily. That should be the last resort. Every child is a work of art. Create a masterpiece. These words are our district motto. They have to mean something and cannot just be empty words that turn into a punchline. We cannot neglect the bullied or forgotten students. Please come to see what we do at YMIHA. Some of you have, but all, including Superintendent Dade, needs to experience what this program means to our students. The next comment comes from Thomas Moffat, and he is a staff person, and his comments are related to funding. Dear Rochester City School District Board, I'm writing you and concerns to the fact that we are in the process of losing many jobs, and in this case, many very good qualified individuals who come every day to help our kids. We need those people in our buildings. Maybe the district should offer another retirement incentive so that we can keep our good young teachers at a much lower salary and let go of some of the older teachers who are ready to leave. Thank you for your consideration in advance. The next comment comes from Jennifer Grimes. She is a staff member and her comments are related to RIA. I'm certain that our RIA community will do a remarkable job this evening presenting all of the reasons why RIA is necessary. I chose that word because it is what the district was quoted as saying that RIA wasn't in the DNC about 30 days ago. That article prompted our community to pile into the board meeting on February 27th to advocate for RIA and help you understand how important our program is for the RCSD. Only 30 days ago, I sat in a room with all of you and many others when President White made it a point to say, quote, there is no, absolutely no initiative, policy, or intention to remove or close down RIA. All right, I am here to tell you, and Terry is here to tell you that there is no intention. If you think you're going to convince us not to close down RIA, you are wasting your time as you are speaking to the choir. There is no intention to do that, not tonight or in the future, end quote. Superintendent Dade even offered to sing to us in a song. His exact words were, I just want to reiterate President White's sentiment. I hate when things that are said get taken out of context. I want to say it so abundantly clear so that it gets printed correctly. There is no proposal to close RIA for next year. If you need to hear it in a song, then he proceeded to sing, we will not close RIA. About 30 days later, here we are in a completely different universe, self-quarantined and unable to stand before you as a community. Either those words were literal lies that were told to our community to quiet us, or you played all of us with the semantics of your words. Looking back, what a fool I was. What fools we were all to believe that. The truth is that the budget crisis was no different on March 26th when this was proposed than it was on February 27th when those statements were made. So what has changed in a month's time? I can only assume two things: lack of information and lack of understanding. The quotes used in the presentation last week, i.e. failures to appropriately enroll and SIFE students, failure to appropriately transition students from newcomer programs such as the Rochester International Academy to their home schools, and failure to adequately utilize transition plans to ensure that students' needs are met during the transition process, do not reflect the work that is being done at RIA or the importance of newcomer programs. In fact, those statements are a reflection of what happens when students leave RIA, not about RIA itself, and of all the work that still needs to be done across the district to support all of our ELLs. That work will not and cannot be completed by September. RIA was created 9 years ago for a very specific reason: to support newcomer English language learners as they arrived in Rochester enrolled in the RCSD. If you look at the data prior to RIA, you will see the differences that RIA has made for our district in regard to ELLs. I myself was a part of a conference call with New York State one day before we were all quarantined. They complimented RIA and commented the work being done was great. They asked us to do work to help support our schools and other schools in the city school district and beyond to prepare for receiving our newcomers after they leave us. To our board members, I hope that you understand the implications of this decision on our entire district, not just the RIA community. I hope that you do your due diligence in getting the truth and facts regarding this element of the proposal, the truth and the facts about why this is in the proposal and the possible implications. Thank you. Our next comment is from Eddie Blanding, who is a staff member and is writing about the 2020-2021 budget. To all board members and commissioners, I just wanted to ask to write you to strongly consider denying the superintendent's current budget proposal as written. Seem as he has decided to cut areas of places and/or people of our most vulnerable students. First, let me be clear. All our students are struggling with what we currently have. Since we are third most impoverished families in the country with all the effects that have on our families and education. Then on top of that, we have students with special needs. On top of poverty, discrimination, frustrated parents, possible abuse, criminal activity in their neighborhood, pressure to join gangs, to have sex, steal, rob, and just sheer survival in the city streets. Social workers and special education teachers are some of the main areas that support students through these plethora of social and emotional turmoils and insane terrain to navigate. Cut SRO, cut whatever you need, but please not social workers or any of the special education services. How could your heart allow such cute? These babies are your babies too. And our final comment comes from Joyce Donsky, a community member. To the Rochester City School District, despite these incredibly challenging medical, social, and financial times, your pending decision to close the international school next academic year is a grave mistake. This school is a shining example of our cherished American traditions and standards of inclusion, welcoming and educating new immigrants. Have you recently read the inscription memorialized at the feet of the Statue of Liberty? The student body of the international school is our best example of this American spirit. The students from the international school represent our most recent immigrants. And if you visit, you can't fail to appreciate this miraculous, joyous school. You cannot miss their enthusiastic embrace of the school's philosophy and their respect and love for the amazing faculty and this unique space dedicated to them. Each teacher goes above and beyond to bring caring and inclusive love and respect to these students and their families. In the midst of the current health crisis, this school, their teachers and students deserve to stay together and open for the coming year. Please do not make such a negative decision. Look beyond the balance sheet and see the necessity of keeping this school open in the truly American tradition of welcoming the immigrant as they seek refuge and new lives in the USA. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Madam Clerk, for reading those summaries. Again, I want to remind folks that there's a mechanism by which you can do that. Our next meeting is this Thursday, and you can file your comments, your written comments, by noon this Thursday by sending a message via email at boardofelucation at rcsdk12.org. Again, our staff will take time allows and the board deems we have that time available. Those comments will be read as they were just a few moments ago. We appreciate, the Board of Education appreciate you all sending those comments. They're insightful, articulate, and directly to the point. And we do take them under advisement, and we do take them quite seriously. So please continue to send them in. If the board gets to the point where the statements are so voluminous that we can't have each of them read online, certainly every board member will be provided a copy of them. Again, 700 people watched our last board meeting. That's more than we could ever fit into central office. And that means the work of the Board of Education and the Superintendent of Schools is being offered and informed at every nook and cranny of our community. So we're encouraged by that. And again, I want to thank the board staff, the communications department, Superintendent Dade, and the board members who were insightful enough, all of us, to figure out that this was a venue that we were going to choose to communicate. And there's a silver lining to every storm, and this appears to be one of them. We're reaching probably more families and citizens than we've reached in the past. So kudos to everybody who's allowed us to do that. I also wanted to mention, I should have mentioned at the very beginning, we were reflecting on the struggles that many people are having, that this district also makes available to people mechanisms by which you can help get yourself through the struggles. As you all know, the district is part of an effort to make sure that our families, our students have meals that they would normally have at their, if they were in school. I believe, Superintendent Dade, we expanded another school today. Is that right? It's number 17, is that right?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah. So the meals are available. We realize this is a critical function that we have taken on as a district, and thanks to Superintendent Dade and his staff, and on behalf of the board, we want to thank all those meal service providers, those people that are providing the meals that, you know, might understandably be feeling like they're at risk by coming into work, but they're doing that because they understand it's important to provide these meals to our children, just as if they were in the schools. The other thing that I want to remind citizens of, since we have so many tuning in, that the Rochester City School District also provides a hotline. And I know Superintendent Dade and his staff will correct me if I'm wrong on this, but there's a hotline for people who are in crisis, need to have some understanding of where to turn. That number is 262-8700. That's 262-8700. The board and the superintendent want you folks to know that we may not have all the answers, but we have a hotline where you can surely find out which direction you need to turn to get the answers that you need. And then finally, there is I think it's called an RCSD Learns, and that's Superintendent Dade, you obviously could provide a better description of that than I could, but the number there is 262-8700, same number, 262-8700. Superintendent Dade, what would one call that number for RCSD Learns? Is that for?
RCSD Learns is more our digital platform for our online learning resources. So right on our website, you can click on RCSD Learns. It's a single sign-on for all of our students who are aware of what their sign-ons are from their day-to-day, grade level specific content, updated weekly, in addition to our hard copy packets that are being made available at our food distribution site.
Excellent, excellent. So again, that number for the RCSD hotline and RCSD Learns is 262-8700, 262-8700. And again, if you wanted to leave your comments before our next board meeting, which will be Thursday at noon, you'd dial in, you type in Board of Education at rcsdk-12.org. And one other order of business, Vice President Elliott is tied up on other business, but I think she'll be joining us at 6:30. Next item on the agenda is consideration of resolutions that were tabled at our March the 20th. Yes, yes.
No.
Mr. Shepherd, yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that I thought that the extra distribution food site was school number 7. I think you said 17, but I just wanted to make sure it was 7.
I did. I think you're right, Commissioner Shepherd. I think it is 7. Is that right, Superintendent Dade? Do you know?
Yes,
it is 7.
The official opening of the school site was school 7 to fill a void that we saw by way of our community. I believe there's something in the works at school 17 with FoodLink to expand that as well. So stay tuned, but school 7 definitely, and I believe school 17 will be online with FoodLink pretty soon.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Superintendent Dade. Thank you, Commissioner Shepherd. And I saw Commissioner LeBron giving me the number 7 sign. So thank you. We are all doing and correct information as possible. So thank you for that correction. Again, I don't want people to miss the point, though. This is a district, an administration, and a board that is very concerned about how people are making it through this crisis. And we realize that the basic elements of life, like eating, are an important part of that. And we've not given up on that important responsibility. So thank you for that correction. Number 7, along with those other sites that were previously announced. And now we'll move on to the consideration of resolutions that were tabled at our March the 28th, 2020 meeting. I need a motion to discuss resolution 783. Is there a motion?
Motion.
Thank you, Commissioner Malloy. That has been seconded by Commissioner Powell. Any questions or comments regarding Resolution 783, which you see displayed up there? Who's doing that? Kalia, you doing that for us? I assume, is that Kalia? Thank you, Kalia. You see Resolution 783. For those of you who weren't with us at our last meeting, sometimes we have questions regarding resolutions, and board members want the opportunity to investigate or do their due diligence and ask additional questions. This was one such resolution that was up at our last board meeting on the 26th. Are there any additional comments or questions regarding Resolution 783? I do see Commissioner Shepard raising her hand. Commissioner Shepard? Commissioner Shepard? Oh, I didn't clear your name? All right.
Oh,
So
no. I needed the resolution to go back up and to scroll down a little bit.
Ben, I had to jump in because I don't have the screen where like we could put our hands up, and I don't know if we're doing that anymore, but I'm kind of confused as to what this resolution is, because my understanding was there was one that had errors in it from last week, and I had asked what the errors were and asked to put that one on hold, and the other one was specifically for golf, but I don't remember seeing this one for athletic uniforms, unless this is a new one for tonight and not the ones that were tabled from last week. I'm trying to pull those up. Hold on.
Madam Clerk? Madam Clerk?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I recall you and I speaking about an hour before the meeting. These resolutions are the ones that were before us on the 26th, and they've been modified.
Yes.
Is that right?
No, no modifications have been made. I did send an email from Tim Schment with the explanation for Resolution 783.
So I just pulled up the resolutions from last week, and the one that was on hold for me was 798, which was the golf one. So expanding that for the amount of 13,000 out of general funds. And then I did see your email from Tim, and that was for Resolution 783. So is that the one? Oh, that's the one that Kalia just put up. So there were two.
Correct.
Okay, so 783. Okay.
Yep, we're on 783. Commissioner Shepard, was your question answered? Or you were trying to move through the screen? You were having Kalia move through the screen to get to the lower part. Were you able to ask your question?
Yeah, I was trying to figure out if this was the actual resolution. I had to go get my packet from last week. But this is not the golf resolution, which is one that I had a question on.
Yeah, that's 798.
Yeah.
And we'll get to that one in a minute. Are there any further questions or comments regarding Resolution 783, which is we'll call it the sports equipment resolution? I can't see the full screen, so if someone could drop the resolution so that I could see the participants. Thank you very much. Doesn't appear that there are any further questions or comments. So we'll move to a vote. All those in favor of Resolution 783, say aye. We're going to do a voiced vote, okay? Are we still going to do that? Madam Clerk, would you prefer that we continue to do that?
I need you to do a roll call, please.
A roll call vote, yep.
Yes.
And for now, we're not, for folks that were watching our process, for now, for today, we're not going to use the yes or no cast, because as it turns out, our members of our community can't even see us how we vote. They can only hear us. So we'll do that. We'll begin with Commissioner Adams. Commissioner Adams. Got to press your mute button. Oh, I see him verbally acknowledging. So I'll take that as a yes. I'm a yes. Just remind folks that your mute button would be at the lower.
Okay, yes.
Yes, there we go. For those of you.
This is Kalia. I'm just letting people know that you can also use your space bar to unmute yourself temporarily. If you hold it down, it works like a walkie-talkie.
Excellent. I didn't realize that. All right. Commissioner Powell?
Yes.
Commissioner Shepard?
Yes.
Commissioner Malloy?
Yes.
Commissioner LeBron?
No.
And I am a yes. So the ayes have it. Next item that we need to have on the floor is Resolution 798. That is what has been referred to as the Gulf Resolution. Can I get a motion to discuss Resolution 798, which Ms. Wade is putting up on the screen right now?
Motion.
Been moved by Commissioner LeBron, seconded by Commissioner Powell. Any questions or comments regarding Resolution 798?
Yeah.
Yep, Commissioner LeBron.
Not me, it was Commissioner Shepard.
Oh, let me just say, thank you. I apologize for that. Just so that folks know that it appears to be a little bit of misunderstanding, when they put up that resolution for the board members to see, you can't see what many of us refer to as the Brady. I can't see the Brady Bunch view, which is I would have the opportunity to see everybody else. It does allow me to see a listing of names. So Commissioner Shepard, I apologize for not recognizing you, but I didn't see your screen.
Before Commissioner Shepard goes, can I just jump in for 1 second,
Sure.
please? Please don't forget that you can use your virtual hand raising, and that if you click where the participants, where it says manage participants, you will be able to see who is virtually raising their hand so that they can be acknowledged. Thank
And
you.
I think if you do that,
I just asked about that, and Van said we're not using that. So we're using that for the raising hands, but not the voting?
That is correct.
those are two, you correct me if I'm wrong, those are two separate keys. One is to raise your hand, and then there's a red and, as you all know, a red and a green button for voting. That's what we're not using today. We are still using the blue hand raising thing. Commissioner Shepard?
Yes, I wanted to know why the number of student athletes had such a large range.
Yes, so good evening, commissioners, and superintendent, and deputies. The anticipation for this upcoming season are 8 programs. And what I had shared initially was that it's a minimum of 5 students per team to a max of 10, which gives us that 40 to 80 ratio.
Okay, that was what I just wanted that to be shared publicly. But that was my only question.
All right, any other questions or comments regarding Resolution 798? There being no further questions or comments, I don't see any blue hands. All those in favor of Resolution 798, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
I apologize, Madam Clerk. Give me a minute. I'll get the routine for tonight. Commissioner Adams just registered his vote. I'm now moving on to Commissioner Powell.
Yes.
I'm then moving to Commissioner Shepard.
Yes.
Commissioner Malloy.
Yes.
Commissioner LeBron.
No.
And I am a yes, so the ayes have it. All right, next item on the agenda is presentation of 21st Century Boardcraft. Just as a little context before we hear from our exceptional General Counsel, Carl Christoph, I want to tell folks that the presentation that you're about to hear is a result of the board's taking quite seriously our action plan to make sure that we are a board that is educated and receives its own share of professional development, training, basically. And we are very fortunate and blessed to have Carl Christoph, who is sort of, has many years of experience, not only in the practice of law, but also dealing with boards. So with that introduction, Carl, you're going to provide for us a presentation that is entitled 21st Century Boardcraft. Carl?
Thank you, Mr. President. Good evening, everyone. One question that might arise, at the outset is why a craft is practiced by someone that has a particular set of skills that are pretty much as much a part of art as they are a part of science. So in my view of the world, and you're going to hear a lot of that next little bit, board members really do practice with a particular set of skills, both the art and science of board membership. By way of an overview, we'll talk a little bit about the board's authority. And if we could go to the next slide, we can see that overview. We'll talk about the board's authority. We'll talk about the board's meetings. We'll talk about some relationships between the board and the superintendent, the district's employees, the district's labor unions. And then we'll transition to talk a little bit about the Constitution and some of the issues the board deals with in that connection, as well as issues concerning its ethics policy. Of course, you can't have much of a presentation that has to do with the law without talking about litigation, so we'll touch on that. And oftentimes, particularly when we get involved in litigation, we have relations with the media to consider, so we'll touch on that. And we'll close by talking a little bit about your relations with the district's attorneys and maybe some other things as we go along and that are prompted by your questions. And in that connection particularly, I'd like to emphasize that to the extent it's possible in this format, this will work a lot better if it's not just a speech. So if you have questions, by all means, please pipe up. I don't have the advantage of being able to see the blue hand raisings while the slides are up. But I think that the board members are sufficiently familiar now with the technology to where they can raise a question just by turning on their mics. And if folks speak over one another, I'm sure that people will give way as they need to. So that's our overview. So starting with the powers of the board, there's the old saying, that as many things change, there are a lot of things that remain the same. And so these are some of the things that remain the same. First of all, the board's authority is defined by a statute. Now, the statute that I have up here, you may recognize, is not within the 2500 series, which normally applies to the Board of Education. The statute that I've listed is Section 1709. And Section 1709 deals with central school districts, but there is a process under the education law called devolution. And Section 1709 is probably the broadest and best descriptions of the powers of a board. And that is incorporated by reference into Section 2500 and so forth, which are the sections that deal specifically with big city districts. So if the board's responsibilities and powers are defined by statute, does that mean that they're also limited by statute? And the answer to that is yes. A Board of Education, like most municipal entities actually, is an institution of delegated authority. In other words, if one can't point to a statutory reason or a reason supported by case law to be able to do something, by and large, you can't do it. And so one of the best questions sometimes that a board member can ask in this regard, especially when they receive a proposal that's a little unfamiliar or may seem a little bit beyond the pale, the question is, what's the authority for that? Where can I find that we have the ability to do this thing that you're asking us to do? Always a pretty good question. So anyways, the board's authority is also limited by a number of other things. The first of which on the screen is constitutions. And constitutions is plural purposely because both the federal and the New York State constitutions bear on the board's ability to do things. And we'll see several examples during the presentation. Things having to do with the concept of due process and equal protection under the law and so forth, all of those things. are driven by the Constitution. There are also that serve to limit the board's authority. As a matter of fact, if we look at the education law in its broadest perspective, it covers almost every single volume of McKinney's consolidated statutes, which will take up a whole wall in a law library. The board is mentioned in volumes going all the way from abandoned property to zoning. You'll find something in every one of those volumes that has to do with boards of education and or school districts. There are rules that also tend to limit the board's authority. Well, what kind of rules are we talking about? Well, in New York, it's the rules of the Board of Regents, which is kind of the state school board, if you will. But they have rules that limit what we can do. And of course, the United States Department of Education has both rules and regulations. The regulations of the U.S. Department of Education are contained in something called the Code of Federal Regulations. But there are state regulations as well, and those regulations are enacted by the Commissioner of Education. And next we have policies. Well, whose policies? The board's policies. The board makes policies, and when it makes policies, I suggest that it limits its own authority at the same time. Well, how can that be? Well, the answer is that once you make a policy and put it on the books, people have the right to have you follow your own policy. And thereby, by making a policy, you actually limit yourself in terms of being able to do something that's not consistent with that policy. Next, we have procedures. The procedures are actually enacted by the superintendent of schools, and the purpose of those procedures are to implement the board's policies. But even those procedures can end up limiting what the district can do, either the superintendent or even the board in some circumstance. And the final one is contracts. And the first thing that comes to everybody's mind when you talk about contracts are collective agreements. Well, I'm here to tell you that the district does a lot more contracting than just collective agreements. We have contracts, my goodness, with all of our vendors, with all of our consultants, with the people who provide the power, the light, the transportation, what have you. As a matter of fact, our office, and you may have heard me talk about this before, we process about 1,000 contracts a year on behalf of the district. And they deal with a whole variety of topics. And a contract, of course, involves the mutual exchange of promises. So while we like to see contracts being enforceable in terms of what people are promising us they can do in exchange for money for the most part, we also make promises to the people who are doing things for us. And those promises will limit us. For example, one of my favorite examples is a contract involving the American Institute of Architects. That's normally a contract that's entered into between us and an architectural firm that designs buildings, but they also have contracts for the various contractors and subcontractors that work on our projects. But the architect's contract has a provision in particular that I have always over the years tried to set aside to the extent I actually negotiate a contract. That's a provision that says essentially if there is a dispute between a contractor, let's say, and the district concerning the aesthetics of a building. In other words, what the building is going to look like, that dispute is settled by the architect. That's what the contract says. Now, thinking about that for a second, that's not very good for a school district or a board of education. Because let's say that the building goes up is really offensive looking, and the community is up in arms about it. And the board is going to point to its contract and say, oh, we're powerless because the dispute is supposed to be resolved by the architect and not us. It's clauses like that, even the little things that limit your ability to act, that sometimes can really hurt you. And in that connection, my advice would be pay attention to the contracts that come before us. Make sure that we're not entering into some kind of an agreement that limits our ability in a way that we might not. So much for the powers of the board, except a couple of other things that you probably have heard me talk about before. The board acts as a body. The board is not an individual collection of individuals. The board acts as a board. Now, there are some exceptions. For example, as the slide suggests, school visits can be an exception. In other words, and as this board actually does, it designates certain of its representatives or of its members to be the board's representatives to particular schools. And that's perfectly appropriate. But even there, just remember that that delegation could not happen without the action of the entire board, to adopt that list of delegated schools. Personnel files is another. We've actually had that example a few times where there's a desire to look at a personnel file. And that's something certainly the board can do. But there is a process, and the process requires the action of the whole board to have that personnel file produced and then examined in executive session by the board as a whole. An individual commissioner, on the other hand, does not have the ability to ask for or examine a personnel file without action of the whole board. So, sort of bottom line, legally, a board member is an official of the state. You're chosen by the voters, and in Rochester, as part of the general election, folks run by parties, which is somewhat unusual in the school district business. But at the end of the day, I like to suggest that board members are trustees. They are folks to whom something very, very important in society is entrusted. And that, of course, are the schools and the children that we serve. It's very difficult in trying to exercise that kind of judgment to be only a representative of some constituency. My suggestion is the commissioner's first responsibility is always to think about the institution. That's what we hold in trust, these schools. So the board acts as a whole, and it does so in meetings. And in meetings, something very important has to be adhered to, and that's parliamentary procedure. Parliamentary procedure really, at the end of the day, does three very important things. Of course, it lends order. And secondly, it certainly respects the majority because we have the notion of majority rule in a democratic society. But even more importantly, it protects the minority. And we'll get into parliamentary procedure, I believe, in one of our future presentations. But this protection of the minority piece is very important, especially under Robert's rules, which is the body of parliamentary law under which the district operates. Roberts particularly goes to some lengths to ensure that the minority does have the opportunity to make its views known. And we've seen, even in our own experience here in Rochester, where the minority has on occasion been able to persuade folks who are on the other side of a question to actually shift to the other side and change their view. That could never happen if the minority didn't have a chance to express that view and the opportunity to convince its colleagues on the other side of a question that perhaps they should change and adopt the minority view. Of course, we have agendas as well, and the agenda is really important It is, as the slide suggests, more than just a list. An agenda should be a plan. And the plan should recognize on almost a meeting-to-meeting basis exactly what happens to be going on at the time that the board is meeting. Do we have a particularly contentious issue? And do we have a lot of people who are in the audience to come and see how the board deals with the issue? And wouldn't it be smart in terms of the agenda while folks are fresh, as opposed to perhaps making it the last item on the agenda? The control of the agenda is important. Of course, a good board meeting is also characterized by the right to speak, not only by the members, which we've already discussed a little bit, but also by the superintendent, who in Rochester, fortunately, is actually a member of the board. So his or her voice is always going to be heard, as any other member's voice would be, and others as well. And by others, I'm speaking of folks like the folks whose statements were read tonight, members of the public who wish to inform the board concerning their views on particular topics. Like this evening, we heard about our budget, we heard about individuals. That time for the public to come forward and address the board is very important, I would suggest. Now, this is something that the board doesn't have to do. Public comment is not required under the law, but in my view of the world, the board has been very wise here in Rochester to allow for that to occur, even under the most unusual circumstances. And of course, we have a policy with respect to the time devoted for public comment, policy 2300, which among its features has the speakers list and the rules as to how one can be placed on the speakers list. A little bit more about board meetings. It's usually a good idea with respect to speakers to have them speak either at the front of the meeting or at the back of the meeting, but not in between other agenda items. The problem is, as important as public comment is, if we don't do it at appointed times and limit in some circumstances the amount of time in the meeting that's devoted to public speech, the board will not be able to accomplish the rest of its agenda. And so there's a balance that needs to be struck. I would suggest in our experience here, we've really been pretty good. We have time limits. I don't know how terribly strict they are, because the board has been very kind in relaxing them on any number of occasions. But as the old saying goes, our meetings are meetings that take place in public, but they are not public meetings. So while the public has an important role to play, on the other hand, the board has a legislative function that it has to perform, and that legislative function at times has to take precedent. From time to time, we hear about the notion of personal attacks. What do you do during a board meeting when someone comes to the rostrum with a view toward delivering some personal attack? Well, in part, personal attacks kind of go with that territory, particularly if you're an elected official. Not everyone's going to like what you do, and they're going to come and complain about it from time to time. It's a little harder, though, when we start talking about personal attacks on others. Perhaps some of our employees, perhaps a student, perhaps another member of the public. There is a time when personal attacks, I would suggest, get to be out of bounds, and perhaps, and this is only one technique that someone suggested a long time ago, you might want to take that kind of a personal attack into executive session and permit the member of the public to inform the board about something that the member feels is important, but which constitutes a personal attack, and which could, because we're in a very public forum here. Our meetings are telecast or they're put out on the web like this one, and people can do others a lot of damage if they're permitted, the totally unfettered right to personally attack another individual. One thing that the board ought to do from time to time, especially where a public comment calls for some sort of a response, but not necessarily a response that we can make on the spot. It's a good in the audience who are listening to the speaker as to how and when a response will be made. And we're pretty good about doing that. Often the presiding officer will get the individual together with an administrator in the audience that could answer the question right on the spot, or at least to say that someone will be able to get back to them with a specific answer to a specific question. It's a good technique and I think pretty good public relations. So getting back to this business about how the board acts. The board acts by way of motions. Those motions are normally prepared in advance, but the motion always belongs to the person who moves it. So if the mover thinks that the motion should be modified, they can. But there are certain technical motions that I would suggest you have to be very careful about before you amend them, like teacher appointments, for example, that have certain statutory conditions that must be contained in the motion before it can be adopted. Another one is financial resolutions, particularly ones having to do with bond issues and so forth. They're very stylized, and it would be far better just to say that, no, I don't want to move this resolution. I don't want to vote on this resolution. I want more advice with respect to this resolution, as opposed to just modifying it as you're making it. It really is not a good policy. So again, what's required for the board to act? Well, as the slide suggests, it takes a majority. But it takes a majority of the full board, not just a majority of a quorum to require action. By and large, if all you have is a quorum, which in our case is 4 members, it takes all 4 to vote in favor of a particular item before it can actually be enacted. So what constitutes a quorum? As I suggested, a simple majority of the entire board. Their physical presence is usually required, although we're dealing with an exception tonight. We're doing a video conference of the entire board. That's something that up until a short time ago wouldn't even be in anyone's imagination. We were still trying to struggle with how you bring people in on a phone conference. But video conferencing is now recognized in the public officers law as a perfectly legitimate way for the board to transact business, so long as, in our circumstance right now, for example, that everyone has the opportunity to tune in, and that a transcription can be prepared of the meeting and supplied if necessary. Now, the quorum has got to be maintained. So what happens when the quorum is not maintained? So then we would deal with what happens if a board member leaves. Well, decision can be made if those remaining still constitute a quorum. However, if we have the departure of multiple members, the meeting will just terminate. Without motion, without anything else, if you lose your quorum, the meeting is done. Now, that doesn't mean that the remaining members can't stick around and can to continue discussing whatever was under discussion. But that remaining number, if it's not a quorum, is not able to make decisions that will bind the board. So what happens if a quorum dissolves temporarily? My suggestion is suspend the meeting and wait until the members return, at which time business can be resumed. We haven't had this issue lately, but we used to, from time to time, have to deal with a board member or members who would want to recuse themselves from a vote. Well, that, it's a fancy term for abstention, actually. And it's usually related to a particular issue. In terms of a quorum, if someone abstains, that's about the equivalent of an absence. That's really what an abstention does. If necessary, if there are too many people who abstain in this fashion, the best action is to delay the matter if that's possible. We've gone for a little bit now, and I am wondering, if there are any questions concerning anything that we've covered so far.
Any questions from anybody? Vice President Elliott?
Thank you.
We had indicated that you were, we had some other professional obligations. We're running a little bit behind. I see Willow raising her hand. Willow?
Yeah, just on the recusal question, we typically, I mean, our policy says we cannot abstain unless it is in fact a conflict of interest, but we don't typically articulate the why. Should we?
The answer to that, by the board's own policy, which was adopted fairly recently, the answer is yes. Board members who recuse are now required by our policy to explain why. Frankly, folks, the board was not elected to recuse itself. The board was elected to vote, and the board should vote, yes or no. Unless, of course, there is a legitimate conflict of interest. And we had a situation a couple of meetings ago where two of our board members on a given question raised the question as to whether they had a conflict, which is the right thing to do. That those questions were referred to the district's ethics panel. The ethics panel resolved those questions, and the board members were then able to act because it was determined they did not have a conflict of interest, although they made a statement on the record just so that there would not be any appearance of impropriety, that there was a thought that there was a conflict, but in fact, it turned out there was not one at all. And that's the perfectly appropriate way to go about that. So when does and doesn't, going to the next slide, a vote constitute a decision? Well, it all begins with a motion or resolution being properly introduced. And we're now on the next slide. And then there has to be an affirmative vote by a majority of the entire board. Again, that's 4 out of 7, not 3 out of 4. A majority of a quorum can't pass anything, but a majority of the entire board, of course, will. Then decisions have to be made in accordance with the requirements of the open meetings law. So what are the essentials of the open meetings law? Well, first of all action has to be taken in public, but there are some exceptions. Disciplinary proceedings against certified employees, that's what section 3020A is about. Something called a quasi-judicial or a privileged manner can also be decided in executive session. Well, what are we talking about there? That's student discipline. When the board acts as an appellate body, it's actually performing a quasi-judicial function. And it gets to do that in executive session, if for no other reason, but to protect the privacy of the students involved. And all of that is covered under the education law as indicated on the slide. From time to time, we've also had questions raised about, well, how about virtual meetings? Well, this is kind of a virtual meeting, but it's a virtual meeting where everybody's in attendance, the public's in attendance, everyone has the opportunity to see what we're doing, to see how votes are conducted. So that's not really the kind of electronic meeting that the law sort of frowns on. The electronic meeting that the law frowns on is where we have a little meeting conducted by email. where someone advances a proposition and then folks start expressing their opinions about the proposition. And even though a vote isn't formally taken, by the end of that electronic meeting, everyone has a pretty good idea as to how the vote's going to be conducted and how folks are going to vote during that proceeding. Not a good thing. I've actually had circumstances where votes have been overturned by a court because the body essentially conducted their meeting electronically as opposed to in public as they're supposed to. Now, there can be some discussion in executive session, but there are parameters. There are only 8 matters that can be discussed in executive session. Those are all listed in the open meetings law. The most commonly used one that we have is something that is loosely referred to at times as personnel matters, but actually they have to do with the appointment or discipline or some other specific action in and that is, of course, as we know, how a motion to go into executive session should be phrased if the topic is going to be some personnel matter. Of course, board meetings are also subject to the Freedom of Information law. And with respect to board meetings particularly, FOIL, as it's known, has a provision that essentially says that if you have some document that is going to be considered by the board during its meeting, to the extent that it's practicable, that document has to be posted where the public can get access to it before the meeting. We have a very nice device that we use in Rochester to do that called Board Docs. And that's why documents are posted on Board Docs, because it's required by the Freedom of Information law. Next thing concerning executive sessions that certainly deserves mention is the notion of confidentiality. There used to be some years ago some controversy about whether everything in executive session should be confidential or not. And there was a real split in opinion. The Committee on Open Government took the view that unless there's some separate statute that says that something should be held confidential, just because you discussed it in executive session doesn't make it confidential. And on the other hand, we had the Commissioner of Education who took the view that, look, when the legislature identified those 8 kinds of things that you can talk about in executive session, there were good reasons for every single one of them. And if you have a properly convened executive session discussing the things that are on that list, that discussion is confidential. And there was a case called Matter of Net years ago that was decided where the commissioner took on, if you will, the Committee on Open Government with respect to its view. And at the end of the day, the commissioner said, look, I'm the one with the jurisdiction here. You guys just give advice, I make decisions. And my decision is, as I have said many times before, things discussed in a properly convened executive session are confidential. Homework. Boards have lots of homework. There are a lot of things in board packets. There are resolutions, there are supporting documents, there are just all sorts of statistical material. And one thing that we've done here, again, to make it as convenient as possible for the commissioners is we have searchable board packets. So the board packet that Jerry Rose in my office puts up is a searchable board packet, and hopefully will help the board members to be able to quickly search and find things that are important to them with respect to a particular meetings. Another thing that happens during board meetings are complaints. Folks aren't always happy with the way the district runs, and they have complaints. Or outside of the board meeting, someone may buttonhole you in the grocery store, at the post office. Before we were practicing a lot of social distancing. The one piece of advice that I would give you with respect to complaints is get the facts before bringing that complaint to a board meeting and commenting on it in public. Again, as you speak from the dais, folks can be hurt, and they can be hurt in a very permanent fashion, let me say, if you harm their reputation by repeating some complaint that turns out not to be truthful. And that happens. And it just doesn't happen because people want to deceive the board. It happens because people are just mistaken about the facts. So it's really important, as the slide suggests, get the facts before commenting in public concerning a complaint. Here's another one that's sometimes controversial. Try to unite behind decisions. Well, what's that about? Does that mean that, at the end of the day, everyone is required to agree on everything, be the proverbial rubber stamp? No, it really doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean that you have to be a cheerleader for every decision that is made. But what the board should do, I would suggest, in uniting behind decisions is not to do anything that undermines a decision that was open session in a duly convened meeting. My suggestion is that a board member has a responsibility to respect that. Now, does that mean that a board member can't at the next meeting say, well, we ought to reconsider this decision? It wasn't a very good decision. No, nothing precludes that at all. I'm talking about business that happens off the record, perhaps during what the slide suggests is a rump session. It's not an officially convened meeting. It's just a group of folks who get together who also happen to be commissioners and off the record try to figure out how to perhaps maneuver the body into accomplishing something. Something to be avoided. That term rump session goes all the way back to Tammany Hall, incidentally, for those of you who are historians. A lot of that used to be done back in those days, and really the objection to that formed the basis for a lot of the very good things we do in exercising the democratic process today. Board members should have some mutual expectations. I would suggest certainly everyone ought to participate, and certainly on our board everybody does. Respectfulness for one another's decisions. That's very, or not decisions, but positions, I should say. That's important. And sometimes it's not real easy, but it's something I would suggest you should always aspire to. And finally, whenever you can, positivity is a good thing. Now, why are all those things in combination important? Because it sets the tone at the top of the organization. Folks watch how the board functions. The president commented tonight, for example, we had 700 viewers at the last board meeting. How they see the board behaves is how they will actually characterize the district. Is it efficient? Does it function well? Or going back to an earlier time with the Buffalo Bills, are we the bickering Bills? Something probably to be avoided. And being positive is certainly part of that. And the final piece, of course, is civility. A lot can be said about civility. Books have been written about civility. To me, civility is pretty straightforward. And in debate, the one way that you can really ensure that civility happens is that you don't ever refer to an individual by name in the process of a debate, or impugn the person's motives for bringing a particular resolution. That really, at the end of the day, isn't what's important. What's important is whether the resolution represents a good idea. whether it represents something the district should do, notwithstanding why the person may have brought it. That really is of little importance at all. Is it good for kids? That's the main question. If it is, vote for it. If it's not, don't. Doesn't matter who brought it or why. So quick comment about civility. So moving on from board members, we're going to start talking about the relationship piece. And the first individual, of course, involved is our superintendent. The superintendent of schools is, of course, our chief executive officer. And in our case, is a non-voting member of the Board of Education. Unusual, something that only happens in big city districts. Certainly, the superintendent, besides being a member of the board, is always a board resource. He, in this case, is the educational leader of the district, and certainly needs to be regarded in that respect. Of course, he's also a policy and action proposer. Not the only one, because as I said before, board members also propose policies and they propose actions from time to time. But like the board, the superintendent also has statutory powers. And it makes the superintendent a little bit different than any other employee that works for the district. The relationship between the superintendent and the board is governed by that statute, and it's governed by the board power statute that I talked about before. And it's probably more analogous to a marriage than it is an employer-employee relationship, because truth be known, the board can't do without the superintendent's concurrence. And likewise, there are things that the superintendent can't do without the board's concurrence. The board and the superintendent really do constitute a team. And of course, their relationship is also governed by a contract. And as I said before, contracts can be limiting. So it's important from time to time to review the superintendent's contract and re-examine that balance that has to exist in order for there to be good teamwork. So as the slide suggests, the superintendent and the board constitutes a team, but it shouldn't be this. Next slide. Yes, here we go. That. It should not be that. Neither party should point to the other and say, well, it's on them. I didn't have anything to do with it. If the superintendent and the board are going to act together, this is not the model. So now, in terms of relationship, let's talk a little bit about employees. Particularly teachers and administrators, where I'll start, are certified employees. They're all subject to appointment. They receive first tenure appointments and then later on tenure appointments. They have to be certified. If there is going to be the unfortunate circumstances as we're experiencing now, consideration for layoffs, there are processes that have to be followed in that circumstance, governed largely by seniority. If you're going to take a disciplinary action, that's covered by a statute. And as a matter of fact, 2 statutes, because of the 2 different classes of employees. Probationary employees are covered by 1 statute and tenured employees by another. And of course, all of these folks need to be evaluated. And the evaluation, folks, is not an option. The commissioner's regulations very clearly require that every one of your certified folks needs to be evaluated at least once per year. And that's governed by the APPR statute. And as I said, the commissioner's regulations as well. So again, we're kind of at a break point, and since our model here is not real consistent with people being able to ask questions, let me stop at this point and see whether or not there are any.
I had a question. I raised my hand.
I'm sorry, Commissioner, I can't see the raised hands on my screen because the slides take the whole thing. So please, what's your question?
All right. I think Van's talking too, but I don't know what Van's saying. Were you talking, Van?
No, I was just saying, Carl, I can see the blue hand, so I can call as soon as you take a break. So,
Well, then, or as folks go along, if they raise, as I'm going along, as folks raise their hand, just interrupt and sure. It's better to deal with the questions as they are raised.
So for me, I've been following along. My only question was just around the certification piece.
Yes, ma'am.
And how long someone has to get certified.
Normally, it's 5 years. And depending on the kind of certification and the kind of employee, it can vary. But you can actually have folks who don't have all of their certification done before they're eligible for tenure.
But in order to be in a position that requires certification, the maximum is 5 years to allow the individual to get their certification?
Yeah, that's it, to get the complete certification, the permanent, if you will. But in order to be hired, someone has to at least have a provisional certificate.
Okay.
So all of our certified people have got to have some kind of certificate before they are hired. It's not only unlawful, it's actually a crime for us to employ folks who are not certified.
I'm going to ask you an executive session later about a particular employee and their certification. I was going to try to ask without identifying the person, and I still will not. But I will reserve the rest of the questions because I guess it's primarily specific to this individual, and so I'll reserve it for executive.
That's exactly where it ought to take place. Thank you.
Okay.
I must be doing really well.
Some of us also went through this last year, Carl.
That is true.
Yeah.
It was good that the board wanted to do it again for the benefit of our new members.
I also think, Carl, too, this will be, since so many people watch, some people have a better understanding of what exactly our rules are, what the rules of superintendent, because I do think there's probably some misunderstanding about what those rules are. So I think this is good for them too.
Yeah, I agree. It certainly should be. Well, okay, then let's go back to the presentation, and we'll begin by talking about civil service personnel. Aside from your certified teachers and administrators, we also have an extensive civil service staff, and it too is governed by the law, primarily the civil service law as opposed to the education law. And so the civil service employees are divided into certain classes. The first class is the exempt class. And the best example of the exempt class are the teachers and administrators, because their terms and conditions are covered by the education law, whereas the circumstances surrounding civil service employment are covered by the civil service law. So the administrators and teachers are exempt. Then we have the labor class, which I think goes pretty much without saying. The hardworking blue collar folks that make up our labor class, they're governed by the civil service law. There are folks who occupy what are called non-competitive positions, and by a non-competitive position, I'm referring to a position that does not require a competitive examination. Now, there are still rules concerning the appointment of these folks, but one of the conditions to their appointment is not having to take an examination. But that's then contrasted with the last classification, which is, of course, the competitive employees. And those folks all have to pass an examination to be even qualified to be considered for an appointment. So then folks are appointed on several different bases in the civil service. The first one is temporary. Now that's something you can't do with certified folks. There is no such thing as a temporary appointment for a certified individual. If we have a vacancy and it's a certified vacancy, we must make an appointment either on probation or on tenure ultimately, but there's no temporary appointment. You can have a provisional appointment. Now, that happens in a circumstance where even though an examination is required, one might not have been prepared by the commission, the Civil Service Commission. And under those circumstances, an individual can be appointed provisionally until such time as there is an examination, at which time they have to take that examination and they have to finish, pretty high in order to continue to hold the jobs that they currently have as provisional employees. And then, of course, there are probationary appointments. The only real distinguishing feature, I would say, between civil service and certified folks is that the probationary appointments for civil service folks are generally shorter than those for certified. And then, of course, there's the permanent civil service appointment, which is pretty close to tenure. And I would think of the two almost interchangeably, as between civil service and certified folks. So that has to do with how civil service employees are appointed. Now, of course, they're also, just like certified individuals, they are subject to layoffs and they are subject to recall, and all of that, just like in the certified arena, and perhaps even more so, is governed by a very detailed and complex set of rules, all designed to, essentially protect against the stuff that used to happen back in Tammany Hall, which is all sorts of favoritism and so forth, where the board was, more, would be back in those days, more of an employment agency than it was a board of education. Well, that, of course, can't happen anymore. That's why the civil service law was enacted in the first place, and why rules involving layoffs and recalls exist. And then finally, just like certified folks, the discipline of civil service staff is also governed by a statute. In this case, it's Section 75 of the Civil Service Law. So the next relationship that we should consider has to do with the relationship between us and the employee represent the district's employees. Now, I use that term employee organization purposely because actually under the Taylor Law, which is the law that governs these relationships, the word union doesn't appear anywhere. And in fact, there was an effort back in the day when the Taylor Law was invented to not draw analogies between the public sector and the private sector. So what we have instead is a whole bunch of euphemisms that were adopted, which really represent the private sector pretty well, like employee organizations instead of unions, or collective negotiations agreements instead of collective bargaining agreements. Well, all of those very nice distinctions have, over the years, kind of fallen by the wayside. But one distinction to remember, however, is that your employees are essentially in two classes. There are employees who are in units, and units of employees are represented by unions. And incidentally, a common fallacy is that everyone in a particular unit of employees must be represented by a union. That's not true. Although everyone within a unit, if there is a union, must be represented by that union, whether or not they're a member of that union. And of course, the other class is the unrepresented folks. And they're largely folks who are exempt from both the Taylor Law and sometimes the Civil Service Law as well. They're the unrepresented. And a little commercial for the unrepresented. Those are folks that you shouldn't forget during times of budget deliberations and so forth. They're very easy to overlook, but by and large, those folks occupy positions that actually make the district go. There are your key line supervisors.
Yeah, Carl, I just want to interject there if I could, please.
Yes, ma'am.
To that point, a lot of our food service workers are not a part of any bargaining unit. And so it's important that we remember, if everybody else is going to get some kind of an increase, that we have to make sure that our food service workers who are not members of any collective bargaining unit also participate in salary increases as well. So
yeah, that would be
I just want to make sure I got that on the table. I'm
yes,
sorry.
that would be particularly applicable to a lot of our part-time employees who may not be members of unions or even considered to be in units per se or substitute employees. Although some of our substitutes actually are organized, but absolutely, we should not ever lose sight of the folks who are unrepresented. They're important too, and they often perform critical jobs for the district.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. So going back to the slides, when we're talking about collective negotiations, those are normally conducted by a negotiations team. And the negotiations team is important because they're the folks who are out on point, and they're the ones who are actually representing the district in the negotiations. And it's important as a board, I would suggest, not to do or suggest anything that would undercut that negotiations team, because after all, they are there representing the board and the district to the best of their ability. And certainly a discussion should be had with them before the board or even individuals on the board take a position that would be at odds with your negotiating team. Now, the board and the superintendent each have specific roles when it comes to collective negotiations. The superintendent's role is actually that of the contracting party. The resulting contract is not between the board and the union. The resulting contract is between the superintendent and the union. And this is one of those areas where I suggested that the superintendent has some statutory authority, which is separate and apart from the authority that's exercised by the board. So then you might ask, well, does the board have any role at all here? Yes, absolutely, a very important role. The board, as a legislative body, is the entity that actually approves of the ultimate result in the collective negotiation, to the extent that that result costs money. So it is the board's role ultimately to appropriate that such an appropriation is in fact appropriate. So the board and the superintendent have separate roles in the collective bargaining process. One thing that I'd like to suggest in that regard, unless the superintendent is at the table or unless the board is at the table, there should only be one spokesperson, or one group of spokespeople if we're going to have a negotiations team. That is just incredibly important because the negotiations process, largely depends on the folks on the other side having trust and confidence that the position that the negotiations team is taking actually represents that of the district. If the folks on the other side, are not of that view, they legitimately should be asking, well, what are you people doing here, negotiations team? Go away. Send us people who have the ability to agree. Not someone who is, just here to go through the motions. So the one spokesperson concept is important. Now, that doesn't mean that from time to time, there can't be what is sometimes referred to as a white knight in the negotiations process. And the white knight is often the person who comes forward with the solution to the issue that has kept the parties at loggerheads. I would suggest, however, that the white knight acts best when he or she does so in conjunction with the negotiations team, and that it be actually a part of the district's overall strategy, as opposed to someone who perhaps might be better characterized as the maverick. Of course, what happens at the end of the negotiations process is a contract. And remember what I said about contracts. Contracts can limit the district's ability to act. in the last analysis, although it might be considered a little crass, negotiations are only about three things: time, power, and money. I think if you're the board, you should always be willing to at least talk about money. From time to time, you should even be able to talk about time. One thing I would suggest you never want to talk about is power. And boards are often tempted when times are rough to spend power instead of money. And I'm here to tell you, I think that's a mistake, folks. You are the ones who are elected to exercise the authority that's granted by the education law. And I don't think that you should surrender that to anyone, because nobody elected them. So contracts are something to which careful attention should be paid. But remember, a board is not a party to the contract. The superintendent.
Hey, Carl.
Yes, ma'am.
I want to go back to one spokesman. How would you recommend that we operationalize that? Because if
at the beginning of the negotiations process, you might want to recall when we were opening up our current negotiations with our teachers and administrators, we all got together and we talked about who was going to be on the negotiations team. We went over a whole series of proposals, things that the board thought was important. We tried to put those into words. We came back at another meeting and we talked about what those words would be. And at that point, the board dispatched the negotiations team to go and bargain and do what it could to achieve the ends that were identified by the board. And that's what your negotiations team did. So really, I think that you operationalized the concept pretty well here.
Okay, yeah, you know what? When I read that, I read it a little differently, and I do see it's under labor relations. But I'm also thinking about, and maybe I could just wait and ask this question towards the end. I'll just wait.
All right, very good. Going back then to the slide, a feature of labor contracts is a process having to do with grievance and arbitration. And a lot of folks, kind of view that negatively. But my answer to that is that this beats the dickens out of stones and clubs. This is an organized process that's required to resolve what often are legitimate disputes, places where the contract is not clear and where people's lives are actually being affected. And at the end of the day, if the parties cannot resolve the grievance during the process whereby everyone gets to say their piece and the parties try to agree, there is a neutral third party who acts very much like a contractual judge, if you will, an arbitrator, who will come in and resolve that dispute. And of course, the arbitrator's rules are binding on us as well as the union. Any other questions on collective negotiations? Well, hearing none, then we're going to move to the next major topic, which is the Constitution. And as I said before, both the state and the federal Constitution have a lot of sway with respect to how we do business. I mean, one of the things that really distinguishes us from most private sector entities is that there's no constitutional overlay over the private sector. But in the public sector, we have this wonderful, at least to me, overlay of the Constitution that we need to think about when we're conducting various activities. So the Constitution pops up in three very basic areas. First, having to do with student rights. Students have constitutional rights. In New York, a student has the right to go to school, the constitutional right. That's pretty unusual in civilized society, actually. But by the state having enacted that provision in its constitution, it created at the same time, just by doing so, a federal constitutional right as well, the right to due process. Now, student rights, euphemistically come on up in two areas. Speaking, students have First Amendment rights and exercise them, and we've seen it actually here this year. We had our students come out in mass to protest some actions that we were considering that they weren't particularly fond of, and they let us know, and that is their constitutional right. The second area, which I euphemistically refer to as spanking, has to do with corporal punishment. A student has a constitutional right not to be punished in an unusual way. Now, that doesn't mean, incidentally, that everywhere, spanking is prohibited. There are states, actually, I think there were 13 at the last count, that still permit students to be paddled for misconduct. Now, that, of course, can't happen in New York. Corporal punishment is very much prohibited. But we have to kind of think about it, however, in terms of what does that really mean? What is corporal punishment? Well, corporal, of course, refers to the use of physical force. And it has to be physical force that is exercised with a view toward punishing a student. So are there times when physical force can be utilized and we're not talking about punishing a student? Yes, even in New York. The commissioner's regulations very clearly provide 3 circumstances under which physical force can be used with respect to a student. First would be to protect oneself. Okay, if you're being assaulted, it certainly doesn't mean that you cannot exercise force to stop someone from pummeling you. Secondly, is to protect someone else. The breaking up of a fight. If physical force is sometimes necessary to do that, and you're protecting someone who otherwise would be grievously injured, you're permitted to do that. And thirdly, to protect the district's property. There's nothing in the Constitution that gives anyone the right to destroy the district's property, and physical force can be used to preclude that. The second area where the Constitution often comes into play is in the area. First one, and a very important one, is the right to due process. And so when the state created the ability for a board to grant a permanent appointment to someone, tenure or a civil service permanent appointment, it created a constitutional right on the part of that individual to his or her job. And that constitutional right is protected by this notion of due process, which boils down to something really pretty simple. An employee who has a due process right has to have the opportunity to be heard before disciplinary action can be taken against them. And as well, of course, also has the right to know what the charge is before a disciplinary action can be taken. Secondly, of course, in the area of discrimination, both the federal and the state government has enacted statutes which preclude discrimination for a whole variety of reasons. And having done so at the same time, they almost automatically create a constitutional right that goes along with that. So sometimes when we defend cases where we're accused of discriminatory action, it's often on a constitutional basis and even in federal court where those kinds of cases can be adjudicated. And the third area is with respect to our public. Now, we already talked about the public right to speak at a meeting. I mean, once you grant that right, an employee, or excuse me, a member of the public actually has a First Amendment right to say what's on his or her mind, with some limitations. Obviously, it's the old story about not being able to go into a theater and yell fire. I mean, that's not protected speech. But the public certainly has a right to free speech. Another one that comes up frequently and has for as long as I've been working with school districts is religion and the schools. And there is a balance there that the Constitution contemplates between the establishment of religion, which we as, quote, the government are not supposed to do, and the free exercise of religion, which we're not supposed to stand in the way of. And that is often a balance that results in litigation.
Carl?
With the schools. Yes, ma'am.
So I think that the Trump administration came out with a new ruling around prayer. So as opposed to it being previously not being able to pray in schools, if I'm understanding it correctly, do we have the legislation, the federal legislation that discusses what is permitted now around praying in schools or prayer? Let me just put it that way. I guess not necessarily in schools.
Yeah, most of that actually, Commissioner Elliott, is governed by case law. And while the administration took a position on that, I am not aware of any legislation beyond that which was adopted about 20 years ago called the Equal Access Act. And that pretty much shaped what constitutes a religious activity as opposed to what is not, and what can be done and when, because the time, place, and manner of exercising one's religious rights is very important. For example, I mean, they should not be exercised in a way which disrupts the educational process, but on the other hand, can't be prohibited during a time when it would not disrupt the education.
So, in other words, can there be a Bible club formed by students?
Yes, ma'am, there sure can be.
All right, thank you.
Sure thing.
Carl, can I just also add that there are some schools that do have like Bible classes that have volunteers that come in and do like extended learning time, and that's
it was my good fortune back in the day to be involved in one of the cases that established that rule in New York. So yes, absolutely. So we'll move on from the Constitution and talk a little bit about ethics. And of course, the question often arises when you talk about something as esoteric as ethics is, what is that all about anyway? And ethics really is a branch of philosophy. It's a study of how you make decisions and how you or don't exercise certain moral principles. It really comes on down to the good and the bad in terms of consequences. So that's what ethics is really all about. And if we move through the slide for a minute, you'll see that at the end of the day, ethics is pretty well defined by the very last bullet, which is a social system in which morals are applied or a code of behavior is expected by a group or an institution. Now, how do you define that? As the next slide suggests, if you have high standards and clear guidance, you generate public trust. And that's all back about that tone at the top. That's the two commissioners a few weeks ago who said, hey, I think I have a conflict concerning a particular question. And they go to get that conflict resolved. And the conflict is resolved in a very public way, and a statement is made. that's the kind of stuff that generates public trust. They know people aren't acting just because they have some direct financial interest in the outcome of a question. It's a very good way of behaving, and is actually required by the general municipal law, which has a whole article which is devoted to public trust and ethics. The board, much to its credit, has its own policy. Policy 2160 was adopted in 2017. And as ethics policies go, and I've been involved in quite a few of them, your policy is a good policy. It's well done. And in fact, it tracks to a certain extent some work that was done by a temporary commission that was put together by the governor several years ago. The whole idea of the commission was to try and close that chasm between the actual and the perceived integrity of public officials. And they did a pretty good job. They came up with a model law. The problem is, though, however, model law never made it out of committee. A very unfortunate thing. But a lot of boards of education, yours included, took a look at that model law, took a look at its own ethical rules, and adopted many, many of its provisions. And so I think, in terms of ethics policies, we're in pretty good shape.
Hey, Carl.
Yes, ma'am.
With regard, we've got a civics policy, and I think Commissioner Powell can speak more to that. How does the civics policy align with our ethics policy?
Well, I've got to confess, I'm not familiar with the civics policy. Commissioner Powell?
Let me look it up real quick. I can't answer it cold, but I'll look it up.
That's one of the ones that Bill Benet will present to us.
Oh, okay. That's civics education.
Oh, okay.
And it expects us to, as a district, to convey many of these ethical concepts of right and wrong. Okay, but the Bill Benet policy in particular described values as like weighing the balance, for instance, between democracy and respecting the rights of the individual versus the rights of the organization, and and finding the balance that allows both functions to coexist.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, and the relationship is fairly plain, I guess, considering that, because the board, as you'll recall, in the very recent past, went through the drill of examining rules of conduct and guidance with respect to its own conduct, and had a very good debate, and ended up actually adopting what is now an attachment to the Code of Ethics on that topic. From time to time, I'm sorry to tell you, public officials get sued. And that's the topic of the next slide. And aptly, I think, I hope, it's titled, If You Are Sued. If you are sued, one of the first things that's going to happen is hand you a complaint and say something creative, like to the effect, you are served. That's not really all that big an event. Folks sometimes make more of it than they perhaps should. But one thing you should do is note when you are served. The when is important, because people who bring actions against us are governed by a statute of limitations. And if they don't serve you in time, they have no lawsuit. So it's important to note when you are served. Often I'll suggest to someone, actually make a little marginal note right on the piece of paper. And often the process server will ask you to sign a receipt. And if you think of it, you should ask them for a copy of that receipt. Then the next thing that you should do When you're served in your capacity as a board member, is get the papers to the district clerk, and do that just as quickly as you can. The reason is that there's kind of a statute that applies to you too. That if you don't get the papers to the clerk within a given period of time, the district can't defend you. So very, very important, as the next bullet suggests, get the papers to the clerk and do it quickly. When you do that, if you are being sued for something that you allegedly did as an official of this district, you should request that you be defended and indemnified. You may remember a couple of years back, we went through the process of adopting a particular provision in the public officers law that provides for the defense and indemnification of both our officials and our employees when they are sued. So it's good to actually request that. Then when you are sued, often you'll encounter something called a litigation hold. Now, we've seen that in a couple of cases. I don't think the new board members have been exposed to it yet. But for example, when the Securities and Exchange Commission began its current investigation, we were asked to both preserve and produce a lot of information. All of that was done pursuant to a litigation hold procedure. And the board members who had this apply to them will remember, they received a rather detailed letter from us, which outlined all of the rules regarding the production of those materials. And even though the Securities and Exchange investigation is not a litigation, it is a pretty good example as to how the litigation hold process works. The next piece, yes.
Was there a complete resolution to that whole SEC investigation? I haven't heard.
No, ma'am. It is still ongoing. As you will recall, we gave them thousands and thousands of pages of documents, which I am sure they are combing over. And they are now beginning to interview various of our employees. And I think probably tomorrow, they're going to be conducting the second of those interviews.
Thank you.
We're a ways away from the resolution yet. One of the good things about the Securities and Exchange Commission when they conduct investigations is that unlike some other agencies which will go nameless, they will not just release something and vilify us. What they'll do rather is they'll share their observations with us first, give us the opportunity to respond, and then draw their final conclusions, which will of course become public. So getting back to the slide, one of the pieces is of course, if you're going to be defended and indemnified, you're going to be working, in many cases, most cases, with lawyers from the Department of Law. And in that situation, I would suggest that you should not talk about the case, except please be candid with the folks from this office who are assigned to the defense and indemnification of the claim. You need to be candid with your lawyer. And by candid, I mean candid. You talk about the case, warts and all, not only the strengths, but also the weaknesses. As you all know, the attorney-client privilege applies to those discussions. So being candid is a good thing, because it's a lot better to know about a problem with your case at the outset, as opposed to being surprised with that during trial. So if you're sued, sometimes you get involved with the media, and we've had a few situations here where we've had to engage with the media. Now, the district has a policy, the board has a policy with respect to the media, and essentially calling for the district to be represented in the media by the superintendent or his or her designee. The board is normally represented by the board president. But there are times when, let's say that you're a board member and you're in the minority on the question, and you want to get your position out, and that the media is interested in hearing your position. Does that mean you cannot talk with the media? No, it doesn't mean that. The First Amendment applies to you just as it does to everybody else. The one thing, however, that you should never do, and that I would suggest you always make clear at the outset of any interview like that, is that you're speaking for yourself. You're not speaking for the board. The board has a spokesperson designated by your policy. The district has a spokesperson, the superintendent of schools in most all cases. So keep that in mind as an overview. But otherwise, in terms of dealing with reporters, it's important not to become too comfortable with them, as the slide suggests. You want to maintain that professional distance, not because you're trying to be unkind, but remember the reporter has a job. The reporter's trying to get at something that perhaps you have, or wants to discover the facts or discover an attitude on your part toward a particular matter. It's important if in fact you don't want to be totally candid, to maintain that professional distance. That's sort of important, because you need to remember, again, as the slide suggests, the news media have agenda. Sometimes the agenda is very plain. There was a while, while I was working in Buffalo, where the Buffalo News had a very clear agenda, and their editorial boards, set it out in no uncertain terms. They did not think the school district was operating well, and they believed that it was their job to expose it. And so the news media can have agendas. My suggestion is, when you speak with the media, that you too should have an agenda. I wouldn't avoid the media just because they have an agenda. You can utilize the media as a tool to communicate your message to large numbers of folks. And it's not unfair at all to have that attitude, toward dealing with the media. You need to, in that connection, know a few distinctions. These are commonly used words, but they're not always clearly understood. There's a difference between a comment that is made off the record and a comment that is made on background. An off-the-record comment is a comment that you never expect to see in print, much less being attributed to you. It's just something that sometimes, and you use it very, very rarely, but sometimes in order to protect an individual, you have an off-the-record comment to sort of, set a reporter straight in terms of what the real story may be. But in order to protect the individual's privacy, you cannot necessarily associate that story with an individual. And so an off-the-record comment is sometimes the way to do that. A comment on background, otherwise, is a comment which reporters often refer to as a comment from an informed source, or someone close to the situation, or some euphemism. Comment is the kind of comment that you don't expect to be attributed to you, but which the reporter can use in the story in terms of the facts that you reveal in that kind of a conversation. Now, all of this requires a great deal of trust between you and the reporter. For example, I would never take the risk of an off-the-record comment with a reporter that I didn't know really well and that I hadn't dealt with for a long time. You know, it's just too dangerous, and too many people can be hurt if that kind of comment is made, you know, without the being able to rely on the reporter to keep it out of the press. Another thing in dealing with reporters that you should be mindful of is deadlines. Reporters work on deadlines. It's important to return their calls, even if you're not going to say anything. You know, you should be responsive, but on the other hand, returning the call after the deadline is passed isn't going to do anybody any good. You or the reporter, for that matter, because remember, if you have your agenda when you're working with the reporter, you know, you have a message that you want to get out, and so it's important that that deadline be honored, because that message isn't going to get out if it's beyond the deadline. Further, you know, dealing with reporters, there are some how-tos. You know, how do you best get your story out? There's a little chart that's attached to this that you know, kind of illustrates what I'm talking about. Information consists of all of these elements. You know, you can have conclusions, you can have findings, you can have validations, you can talk about your methods as to how you reach conclusions, and you can talk about information. In my view of the world, you want to stay as close to the top of that chart as possible. I would rarely get beyond findings in talking with the press. First of all, you get into the weeds and your message gets lost. The message is really delivered with the conclusions and maybe the findings. Especially in an interview situation, you should think about up front, you know, how deep do you want to get into the weeds? Staying near the top is a good idea. And the other thing that works really well is the single overriding communications objective, commonly referred to as the SACO. You know, that's the ultimate message. If you know, if the reporter or the public hears nothing else from you, this is the one thing you want them to hear. Now, you know, considering our current coronavirus, you know, there have been other times when we have had health emergencies in the United States and communicable disease. And the last time that there was one that was really widespread, a guy by the name of Bob Howard was the communications director for the Centers for Disease Control. And Bob was a very interesting guy. You know, he was a well-turned-out guy. He had a good speaking voice. You know, he's the kind of person that you'd want to have on television. And oh, by the way, he was also a physician. And so he was an authoritative guy to boot, you know, to almost like your perfect CDC spokesperson. And so he was invited during this last crisis to go on a talk show. And knowing this concept of having a SACO, he set up something with the host. And he told the host, well, you know, toward the end of our interview, why don't you ask me, you know, what is the one single thing that the public ought to know about this brand of flu that was circulating at that time? And sure enough, you know, true to form, the host asked the question at the end of the interview. And Bob's comment was this. This was his SACO. If it's wet and it's not yours, don't touch it. You know, just thinking about that for a second. You know, a pretty good SACO, you know, a little humorous, but at the same time, really got the message across. And I would say that SACO is just as applicable today during our coronavirus as it is or was back then when Bob first talked about it. Another SACO applicable to school systems is also at the bottom of the slide there, the for example comment. I mean, one thing that you know, you might always want to start with is in the Rochester City School District, the safety of our children is always first. And oh, by the way, the children that can be done to protect them. And if, let's say, for example, we're talking about a biohazard, if you have a statistic that'll help you out, you might want to say, there hasn't been a single valid biohazard resulting from terrorism in the United States in the last 40 years. Pretty good sacco, you know, not particularly funny, but it certainly does get the message across in a very forceful way. And really, at the end of the day, the message is, think about it in advance. Before you go into that interview, have that sacco in mind. You know, the one single thing that you want the public to walk away with after hearing what you have to say.
Hey, Carl?
Yes, ma'am.
I think the thing that I think the community wants to know is there is authenticity. That what we are communicating is that we're being authentic about it, that we are just not putting a sort of rote kind of message out there. That's why I believe that the community has little trust in the or confidence in the school district, because it seems like we're always putting a spin on it. And so I'd like to know, how do we continue to be authentic and tell the truth without, you know, providing everything that you cannot provide at the time. And that's, even me personally, you know, since I've been on this board, there's always been a spin to the message. And it just is, it's disappointing because in my view, it still doesn't get to connecting with our community in a way of which they could say, in other words, it may be some bad news, but if we're being truthful about it, they're able to connect with us better. And oftentimes in this district, since I've been here, it has just been sort of rote, written up kind of information without it really being truthful, because this community knows what's going on. And it's just a matter of us, if we want to really connect and develop the relationship, to really just affirm, you know, what their thinking is. But if we are, and even there are times when in the community that I've had the experience when they didn't agree with the decision that was made, but if I can get to them and tell them the reason as to why those decisions are made, they still may not agree with it, but they accept it. And so I just want to make sure, or to have you to chime in terms of it being the single overriding communication objective and it being authentic. Can you comment on that?
Yep, the sacco should be authentic. What you don't want to feed is anybody's bias against the school district, because again, we're trustees of the institution. So while we certainly want to be truthful and we want to be authentic, we do not want to say anything that feeds into somebody's bias against us. That's really the ultimate message. Telling the truth and owning your mistakes, for example, is something we should be very willing to do, because that's what builds up trust and confidence. And this whole place really, you know, runs on trust and confidence. You know, mom and dad have got to be confident on Monday morning that they can send Johnny and Sally to school. You know, and know that those children are going to be well taken care of by us and well educated by us.
Well, I think that's part of the issue, that there are people in the community that doesn't feel that way, particularly when you look at our academic standard. And so, you know, again, it's about being truthful, but then getting the message out there in a way in which, from my perspective, is that we're being truthful. We are affirming some of their concerns, or even we are, you know, helping to correct them, you know. But it's almost, the messages come out, as far as I'm concerned, as if Rochester City School District doesn't do anything wrong. That everybody in the district is career and college ready. Well, we know that's not the case. Now, we're working on it, but let's not act like, you know, we are doing all this work to do it when you know, my years of being on this board, It's been a long process. We have not done it. In other words, we don't need to defend ourselves. Let's just put the truth out there the way it is and then move from there. Because that way, in my view, I believe that we have community. If we were just able to be authentic about where we are. And in many respects, over the years, we haven't done that, in my opinion.
Yeah, the one exception I would say, though, is that we should be willing to stand up for ourselves when we're right, and to fight against any implicit bias that may exist by reason of who our students are or where they come from. There are an awful lot of factors that affect the ultimate educational outcome for any student, be it here or elsewhere. The only thing that I would urge is that we don't do things that tend to put us in a light that we don't deserve. Should we own our mistakes? Sure, we should. But is everything that ever happened to any student only our fault? I don't think so. This is a complex problem, and like you said, Vice President Elliott, we're working that problem.
Yeah, it's a matter,
lot of fronts, we're having success in working that, and so why should we not highlight those things that we are trying to do? Because I don't think anyone is really going to argue that anybody here is not out for the best interests of the students.
Well, that could be argued, in all honesty, but I don't need to have that conversation. But the conversation, I just want to make sure that as we are telling the story, that we're also affirming that we got a lot of work to do, a lot of work to do.
And I think I've heard people deliver that message.
Yeah, as opposed to saying, well, we're not there yet. I mean, just be upfront. We got a lot of work to do in this district. We've got some good things that are happening, but there's still a lot of work that has to be done in this district, and we're working on it.
Yes, ma'am. I don't think anyone would argue with that.
That's the authenticity that I'm referring to.
Yep.
All right.
Anyone else want to weigh in? Okay, then going back to the slide, one of the practical realities to remember, particularly if you're dealing with the radio or television, is that you're really talking about a soundbite. And this is between 8 and 15 seconds of time. That's the time period within which you've got to get your SACO across. And again, it's not about not being authentic. It's not about being untruthful. It's about being thoughtful about what you're going to say and how what you are going to say is going to affect your organization and the people who work for your organization and their morale. Because again, the tone is set at the top. If folks feel as if they are not valued, notwithstanding their efforts, they're not going to feel good about working for you. And when you're in a people business, that attitude transfers to the children with which we deal. There's a quick word about press conferences at the bottom of this slide. It's something I would suggest if we have the opportunity, you ought to avoid if you can. Now, sometimes you just can't. I mean, the events are breaking so fast. The only way you can get your message out is to do a press conference. But reporters like one-on-ones. And a series of one-on-ones will beat a press conference every time. Because in the press conference, you're only limited to the questions that you're being asked at the moment. Whereas if you're doing a one-on-one interview, you have much more of an opportunity to give your story some dimension, some depth. Another practical piece of advice at the top of the next slide is not to be afraid to ask for readbacks. Good reporters, they actually do want to get it accurate. So I've been known from time to time to say, now, what did you just write down that I said? Let me think about that with you. Is that the best way to express this? As I said, a good reporter isn't going to chafe at that. Now, you're not going to be able to do that so often with a television reporter, for example, as opposed to a print media reporter. But on the other hand, even television reporters, if you're doing a one-on-one and you're on camera and you want to do a retake, by and large, the good reporters will let you do that. during a press conference, and folks violate this rule a lot, it's better to have one person at the podium than a whole line of individuals, because folks end up watching the line of individuals and not listening to what the message is. Our president has time with that from time to time, because, as you know, sometimes he says things that don't either make a lot of sense or can be criticized in other ways, and folks will focus in the line behind him, seeing their reactions to some of the things he says. It's not a good way to conduct business with the press, I would suggest. Certainly, we are concerned and compassionate and caring, and we should certainly appear that way, and not to lose your cool with the press. It's never, I would say, a good idea. The old saying is, that you shouldn't get into a fight with an entity that buys paper by the carload and ink by the barrel. There's just no win in that. The last thing I would suggest is, whenever you say no interview, no response, you actually lose an opportunity. And that's the opportunity to get your side of the story out. Because believe me, again, as the slide suggests, if you don't have anything to say, it'll create a vacuum. And that vacuum will be filled by the media. Couple of things, again, talking about litigation and such, are your relations with the attorneys that work for you. As the slide suggests, we're your legal resource. We are in the advice business, folks. We're not in the decision business. And we shouldn't be making decisions. Now, from time to time, certainly, hopefully our advice will influence the decision that you will make. But it's not our job to make decisions. We will give you advice, we will be your counsel, and we certainly will engage in advocacy on behalf of this district. Secondly, I have two questions that lawyers get asked. One is my favorite question, and one is not such a question. And I'm on the second bullet of this slide now. My favorite question is, can we or can't we? And if we can, how do we go about it? And what can happen if we do this? Those are good questions, I would say, because they're before the fact. My least favorite question is, Carl, we did something yesterday. Is it okay? Not a good question. Because any advice that I could have given you to help out, or that any of our folks here in the law department could have given to help out, of course, is not of any value in that context. It's probably a good idea to have a policy in terms of contacting folks in the department. In my view, unless there's a specific individual working with the board or with a member of the administration on a specific issue, if it's a question of the first impression, I would like to know about it in advance. It helps me kind of manage the place, and to give the board member a steer to someone who can really give them some subject matter expertise, because as you know, the lawyers in our office are kind of separated by function, whereas all of us strive to be as good education lawyers as we can. We each have our strengths and our weaknesses, and I'm kind of the traffic conductor in that regard. So the usual way to go about it is to let me know first, and then I'll try my best to give you the best steer that I can. And the last point is that while back in the day, the attorney for the district was often referred to as the board attorney. That's really a misnomer. We're really the district's attorneys, and we work for the district. We should have no skin in the game. We should be objective, and to that end, we are really most interested in the rights and obligations of the district as an institution. as opposed to the rights and obligation of any particular individual, be it a board member or an administrator or a teacher or anyone else in our organization. Finally, I kind of have a commercial for associations of school boards, which over the years I have found to be very valuable, not only for their conferences and workshops, but also because they are often the strongest political voice that we have. And three of them that come immediately to mind that are applicable here are the Monroe County Association of School Boards, the New York State School Boards Association. They're all three very valuable from this standpoint. We also, in terms of a lobbying arm, work with the Big Five. I was very grateful and frankly privileged to be introduced very lately to the Council of Great Schools, Great City Schools. I had the good fortune to be able to deliver somewhat of a presentation to them just recently. So with that, we've, I think, talked about what there is to talk about in terms of Boardcraft. And if you have any questions in that regard that we haven't addressed, please, now's the time.
Hey, Carl, I just wanted to add some perspective. You had indicated in your last comment about district attorney, who that person or who that office served. You indicated in some arenas, it is believed that the district general counsel is the counsel for the board. Some people may not know that, but that wasn't the case here in Rochester, most certainly. And this board evolved that role into its present role, which you just articulated, which is the general counsel serves the district, the Rochester City School District, not the superintendent and not the board, but he or she advises on behalf of what is in the best interest of the entire district. So I just wanted to let folks know that in the past, this is before you got here, Mr. Christoph, there was sort of this tradition that, different than what you described in your last comment, there was this tradition that the general counsel was the attorney for the superintendent. And this board, not this exact rendition of the board, but the prior board rejected that because we believed, as you do, that the general counsel should be advising on behalf of the entire Rochester School District, which would be represented by the board and the superintendent. So, and I gotta say, you have done an awesome job in serving the citizens of this community, the parents, the staff, by providing, as I think I've heard you say on a number of occasions, you don't have any skin in the game. You're just trying to make sure that you and your staff are providing the best legal guidance for the entire district. So we appreciate that, and we appreciate the fact that you have brought us to the center point, which is having the general counsel available to the entire citizenry. So thank you.
Thank you, that's very kind. So with that, folks, if there isn't any—
Carl, yeah, I did have a question. I was just trying to get my mute button to work. As you recall, I had mentioned that I would leave that question to the end because I was, with regard to who speaks for the district. I think there's some concern about, if, for example, if you are a board, if you are a chair versus the president, how do you work that kind of situation out? Under the labor relations negotiations, I actually thought that was something else. So that's why I waited to ask it towards the end, where you indicate that there needs to be one spokesperson. So in the case where there's a scenario that's coming up, and you have a board committee member that may address the issue, but then there's also the president who may speak on the issue. What kind of advice can you give us in terms of who should be the spokesperson on that kind of in that kind of a situation? Is it the president that always has to represent the board, or could the chair of that committee represent speak to the press in that regard?
Well, the president of the board represents the board because the board enacted a policy that says so. The board could just as easily enact a policy that says that the chair of every committee gets to speak on behalf of the board concerning any matter appearing before the committee, or any variation of that. The thing to remember, hearkening back to something we said right at the very outset, the board acts as a body. And if the body chooses to have someone to be its spokesperson, it doesn't really matter if the person's the chair or the president or a commissioner. The word of the board is final in that regard. Again, however, I have to emphasize, the First Amendment is alive and well, so long as the board member doesn't represent that he or she is speaking for the board, when in fact he or she is just delivering their person's perfectly free to speak on any matter.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
So I don't have a question, but I got two comments. One, well done for your PD. As a new board member, I got a lot out of it. Also, I'd like to give a shout out to Talia Wade. Prior to coming on the board, I was a part of a national team of a diversity crew. I must have done 30, maybe 50 Zoom calls. Never did I know you could push the space button, get off mute. What a jewel you gave me today, Talia. Thank you.
You're welcome.
and thank you, Kalia, for running the slides. You really did great.
And let me just say, Commissioner Adams, that was deep. Real deep.
I try to keep up with you, Carl. It was very difficult, but I stuck in with you.
So if there's nothing further with respect to this part of the meeting, I'll very gladly return the floor to the president.
Thank you, Carl. Again, to repeat what other folks have said, well done. This is the kind of professional development that you've been giving to board members for many years. And I remember when we first, along with the superintendent at the time, decided to hire, I remember Vice President Elliott saying she had seen you, I think at some NISBA events. And is that right, Vice President Elliott?
Huge fan. Yeah,
huge fan. And you have only built on that reputation. We appreciate it. This isn't the first professional development he has given us. And every time that we seek his advice in executive session or elsewhere, he has been there to provide us that guidance. So well done. And like my colleague said to Kalia, I know you're like the Wizard of Oz behind the scenes, you and Tom and Amatisol making all this stuff happen. So we really do appreciate that. I don't know too many people that can push a PowerPoint presentation and keep it synchronized with somebody else is speaking. So well done, Kalia. We appreciate that effort. And I do want to say that, just to remind folks, that even before the distinguished educator got here, this Board of Education has engaged in professional development. We had a number of board retreats. We did a retreat most recently that Carl was not leading, but it was a retreat basically on a book. What was the name of the book again? Somebody remind me? I know Marisol, you'll remember the name of the
10
book.
questions every board member should know.
Thank you, Kalia, that first about history. At Vice President Elliott's insistence, we've even had broken bread together. We probably need to do that again. This is one of many professional developments. Thank you, Carl. And we have others planned for down the road. As Carl indicated, we're going to have one on Robert's Rules of Order. So thank you, Carl. This was well done. I hope people stay tuned and watch this, because they can learn a lot about boards of education. And tomorrow, I think, or the day after, I'm going to be participating in the Council of Great City Schools, and they're going to be talking about how you use this kind of digital platform to do things like professional development. And once again, as you said, Carl, we need to pat ourselves on the back. While it's not often, we're often getting beat up on the back. We need to pat ourselves on the back for things that we do well. And this was one example of the things that we do well. So thanks again, Carl. We appreciate that. Next item on the agenda is a new business. Commissioner Powell had two matters that she wanted to have addressed. The first was dealing with that letter that Commissioner Powell suggested we ought to be drafting to the governor regarding his most recent statements about how he might handle the state's financial situation. Commissioner Powell, you want to pick up on that?
Could we do the cube one first? It'll be quicker.
Sure, absolutely. Why don't you go ahead and describe what your concern or your concern is there?
Okay. First off, I was planning to go to Chicago for the National School Boards Association meeting, which would have had the CUBE annual meeting as part of that function. Was there anyone else on the board who was planning to go to Chicago this spring? It's been canceled. No? Okay, so one of the things that was going to happen during the CUBE annual meeting was to elect the CUBE steering committee. And today they had a conference call where the candidates for the steering committee gave their 3-minute pitch. And the ballots, the closing of the I didn't want to presume that I could vote on behalf of RCSD, but since I was the one who was supposed to attend, and it would have been at NYSBA's, New York State School Board Association's dime if I had gone, I didn't want to presume to cast the ballot for RCSD, but especially since we have an opportunity to talk about it. But I did hear all of the candidates, and if I were to cast the vote of my own conscience, I would have voted for the 6 members that were recommended by the nominating committee. And I wanted to ask the board if I have your blessing to do that. I have the ballot, the electronic ballot in front of me right now. And I won't push the send button until I hear that that's okay.
Just as a little quick context, so people who are watching and maybe some of the newer board members, I know Commissioner Malloy called me and asked me some questions. The Council of Urban Boards of Education is the largest organization that represents urban districts throughout this country. They are an affiliate organization of the National School Boards Association. Actually, they are actually one of the more effective branches insofar as they bring in a lot of membership and a lot of money to NSBA. A lot of the other councils aren't able to do that. As part of our being in good standing, that is, we pay dues, as do those other school districts. They have small-sized school districts, mid-sized school districts, and large-sized school districts. We pay a dues consistent with the size of our district, and that makes us a member in good standing. That allows us to have one vote at their elections. And as Commissioner Powell said, they elect people to their steering committee. And then once you're on the steering committee, they elect officers annually. I was on the CUBE steering committee for, I think, 5 or 6 years. I was elected president for 2 separate terms, and then I was not eligible to continue on in my service because they had term limits. And so now they're having elections, and we get to pick a slate. The slate that she's referring to is picked by I believe, if I recall correctly, by the existing executive committee. People apply. You might have even gotten an email, but maybe didn't open it up. You could apply to be one of those people. They pick, the nominating committee from the executive committee picks who the slates of candidates are. You could even run from the floor. I don't know if they did that, Commissioner Powell.
Well, that's the thing. There are 2 nominees from the floor that submitted their nominations outside of the nominating committee process.
So after giving that little bit of history, personally, I would support you. I didn't participate in the meeting today, but I would support your judgment in terms of the slate, particularly since it seems like the existing body has vetted those candidates. But I don't know what anybody else thinks about it.
I participated in half of the meeting today. Unfortunately, I had another conflict, so I wasn't able to listen to all of the candidates. But I would trust Willa's judgment on this, having participated in half the program.
I think you've gotten the direction from those who are willing to offer it. So you can press that button whenever you have the time to do it. Mr. Adams, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I didn't put in the go. I had no interest in really going in April. So I wouldn't have no problem with you supporting me, Willa.
I'm sorry, you don't
Wouldn't have a problem with you supporting us, representing us.
About representing. Okay. So, well, the conference was canceled for obvious reasons, but they're hosting this this election electronically. So I'm waiting to hear any objections. Now's the time to raise them if you have any.
I don't think there are any, so I think you're good to go.
Okay. Well, I hit done. Okay, that's done. We just voted, folks.
Before you continue, let me just say to our clerk and to my colleagues, perhaps now is the time for us to revisit those outside organizations and determine who is serving what. We lost one of our commissioners, and I'm serving in her place only temporarily with the Big Five. But there's a host of organizations, and I want to make sure I'll go over those organizations and make sure we have people assigned. But if you have a particular interest in serving in any organization, please let me know, and the clerk and I will make sure that you get that designated spot. But CUBE is one of those great organizations, and to have individuals designated also allows us to understand where financially the commitments might need to be. In other words, there was this convention for NISBA, the National School Board Association, that was going to include CUBE. Looks like Commissioner Powell was set to go, but all these organizations, many of them have meetings and conferences. So what I'll have our clerk do is pass out the list of organizations, find out if we have any gaps in terms of assignments. And if there's a gap to be filled, please let Marisol know that you're interested in filling that slot. Commissioner Powell, I think you had one other item that you wanted to discuss.
Yeah, so last week.
I'm sorry, yes, Commissioner Powell.
Yeah, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
It's kind of broken up a bit, but yep.
Okay, so last week the governor. You still having trouble?
Keep trying to speak.
Okay, last week the governor had been quoted in several sources that no function of the state would be held harmless in the upcoming budget discussions in this COVID-19 environment. And his remarks came across as really quite callous and reflected a kind of lack of sensitivity to the fact that education funding is in fact based on is an equity conversation, that school districts that have solid property values don't get very much aid from the state, and those of us who have need of that cannot raise our funds locally are the ones primarily that get state aid. And there's nothing about the governor's comments as they were quoted that reflect any sensitivity to the equity question. And when you first tried to raise this issue just now, President White, you suggested that I was advancing the concept of a letter. I'm not. I'm advancing the concept of a prepared statement because I am fully convinced that this topic will come up again and again, that the governor will again say that that no one will be held harmless, that school districts will have to share the brunt of cuts. And he'll say it, I believe, in an equally insensitive way. So I would like to see us frame a statement that could, because it's important that anything we have to say be timely, right? And what he said last week is old news now, but we need to be ready for his next utterance. And I think we need to frame this conversation as an equity conversation. And so with that context, the comments that I wrote last week and submitted on Thursday, I reread them, and I think there's still a good basis there for a prepared statement, although quoting the governor's specific remarks might not be prudent or useful going forward, because he's going to say it in a different way the next time. But I think we do need to be prepared to call out the governor around speaking about education from the standpoint of sharing the burden, or no one, I can't protect you from reality, that we should call him out and make sure that he speaks with some sensitivity about the equity issues in education.
Any responses to what Commissioner Powell just said?
Add that, like, part of those comments were in relations to what's happening with COVID-19. And I think that the entire state of New York, and not just our school district, but the entire state, all the counties, cities, certainly New York City, are being hit right now with a really harsh reality, not just around the funding and the equity. We have our own equity issues. If you go through the budget book, there's a bunch of inequities in that book for me. And so we do have some say in how we address inequities within our district. But in regards to the comments that he made, I don't want to say that I don't want to respond to the governor in terms of ensuring that we're funded, because right now we're in a really dire situation, and we'll know more tomorrow whether we're even going to get the 35 million. But I think those remarks that she just quoted were specifically talking about the impact of COVID on the entire state and the entire budget and the revenue stream. So that's all I'll add to that.
I agree with Commissioner LeBron that that is the context. But as I said, I believe he said what he said in a really insensitive way. And I think we're within our right to ask him to be more thoughtful about how he says it, and to recognize that by, the reality, I mean, his phrase was, no one is held harmless from reality. I cannot protect you from reality. Well, the reality is that there are districts that are not going to suffer from, there are school districts that are not going to suffer any financial loss as a result of property values. They're still going to be able to collect their tax levy, and they'll be able to do just fine with or without state aid. The thrust and that I want to get, that I want us to advance, irrespective of whether we suffer financial loss because of COVID-19, is that there are ways to talk about education and that recognize that state aid is a function of trying to bring equity into an inequitable situation. And this most recent pass through, the governor did not exercise any sensitivity to that.
Mr. President, I would think, though, Commissioner Powell, while I hear what you're saying, I would want us to give the governor a pass, only because of what he's going through now. maybe if he wasn't under the kind of duress that he's under now, maybe he would have been able to say it differently. But I mean, with all that he's going through, and I think that if we do decide to provide a statement, that there's some kind of compassion in there from this district, this board, that shows that supports, you know, the heroic effort that he's doing around COVID-19, and yet in some way just say, don't forget about us, because we're the, you know, the lowest. We're in a district that is high poverty. We need the money, but I just wouldn't want to put and these are my words, not yours, Commissioner Powell. I would not just want there to be a statement out there that does not show any compassion in what the governor is going through right now.
Commissioner LeBron?
Yeah, so I agree with Commissioner Elliott, and I do also understand what you're saying, Commissioner Powell. I think also that some of that is a matter of perception, because I hear his briefings every day, and I didn't feel offended by how he said it. I think he was very blunt and direct, and I think that's a New York City thing too, to be very blunt and direct. So I think right now, given the state of COVID and the impact, again, that it's just going to have on the entire state and a lot of unknowns, and I don't know if I could even say that there are going to be some districts this year in New York State that are not going to be impacted financially, whether they get funding from the state or don't get funding, just based off of COVID and the impact that it's going to have on the entire economy. There's just so many unknowns right now. And just let me just throw this, like speaking with my own sister yesterday in New York City, I know that the governor goes on every day, but it is a very different view for people who are living this in New York City. There are 365 people in ICU in my sister's hospital. So they're given masks to disinfect. There is not enough supplies. There's not enough ventilators. And I think, I mean, it's to the point where they are touching bodies with forklifts because they don't even want to physically touch them to remove them out of the hospital and putting them in cold trucks. And like, this is the state that New York City is in, and they're not that far from us. And so I say that primarily because I need people to understand that what Rochester looks like and how we're interacting with COVID is vastly different from other parts of the state. And I don't know what's going to happen, but I do know that economically, this is going to be impactful for the entire state.
I don't see any other hands being raised, so I just wanted to.
Mr. President?
Yes, if you could just, in the future, go ahead. But we're trying to make sure that we raise our hands on the little button.
Yeah. Just want to also add, you know, as we all know, if we looked at the media reports, the governor's own brother now is has contracted COVID-19. So, you know, this thing has an emotion. He's done an exemplary job, but I know that this has to have it's weighing on him, you know, particularly with New York, the state of New York being the epicenter of this disease in the nation. So, you know, I just want us to, you know, offer compassion.
Go ahead, Commissioner Powell.
You know, I appreciate both Commissioner Braun and Commissioner Elliott's input. So here's my thought. At some point, somebody from the press is going to ask us to respond to the governor's position. So what if we were to take the language that I've sort of cobbled together last Thursday and ask someone from our communications office to create a more general statement that speaks to equity and the role of the state in education and education funding. Would that be at all helpful, a compromise? Because I think we would be making a mistake if we did not come together around some language, either as, you know, if we don't do it proactively, we're going to end up having the conversation again later on. And if we're proactive, then we can incorporate our own sensitivity to what the governor's going through that Commissioner Elliott and Commissioner LeBron just expressed, while calling on the governor to be a bit more sensitive to the equity question. We can't let him off the hook on the equity question.
So, Commissioner Powell, I see the difference is really tied up in two words: helpless versus harmless. It is true that probably, given the situation, most districts will be harmed. That's inevitable. The resources just aren't there. But some districts might suffer more harm because they are helpless. In other words, we don't have the independent taxing authority. Some of these suburban districts that will be harmed, we all will be harmed, have other resources, not to mention the ability to levy taxes, but the ability of their families and their homes to compensate through their own salaries or their 501ks or their ability to get loans from moms and dads. So I think that's the difference that you're talking about. And so we don't have to focus necessarily. I would agree with others to say that, you know, I'm sure you would agree. I think Governor Cuomo, although I don't agree with some of the words, his word choices, he is doing an amazing job in a very difficult situation. And it seems to me, though, you've offered somewhat of a compromise. Draft something, because this issue of equity, harmless versus helplessness, financial helplessness, is an ongoing issue. It's not, and it's an issue of equity. It's not going to go away. And rather than seizing on maybe some words that others might think are inartful, that might have been said because this is a tough situation. He's trying to figure out how to, like we are, we're trying to figure out how we're going to manage this situation. Maybe he said some words that weren't the best. Maybe you should draft something that generically speaks to the issues of equity, helplessness versus harmless, being harmed, and give it to us on Thursday. And that document, that statement may come of use later on. You know, let's say, for example, he does propose that he has some flexibility in that statement might be very helpful, particularly if he doesn't differentiate between suburban districts, which have the ability to levy taxes, and urban districts like ours, the Big Five, that cannot. What do you think? If you were to just draft something, let us take a look at it Thursday.
If you're all willing to consider it some more, I'll put more energy into the language. I think I'd feel more comfortable if a communications expert weighed in with me, someone from the superintendent's office, perhaps.
I know Carlos is probably not online, but why don't we, there's Terry. You think she could go to Carlos and talk to him about such a statement?
Absolutely.
Okay, there you go.
Okay.
Got it.
Thank you.
All right.
Dan,
Yep.
I didn't raise my hand in
Yes,
the
sir.
space bar because I just learned that tonight too from college. I do want to add though that right now there is a campaign both from the community and asking the state, asking community members to reach out to the state legislator majority leader Andrea Cousins, and then also the education chair, in particularly asking them to fund us the $35 million and make a plea for this community. So if people are watching tonight, if you get a chance, I posted it, it's being tweeted out by lots of different folks. But we ask that you please reach out to your state legislators and at least give us our $35 million funding. So that's my ask publicly.
I think that's a good ask. I wish we had said that earlier on during the meeting. I probably imagine there are more people watching earlier than there are now, but we should, if there, for some reason there isn't a vote, which I imagine there will be on the budget, we'll be hearing something. Somebody even said maybe as late as tonight or tomorrow morning or tomorrow afternoon. The governor does value getting an on-time budget. He's had a consecutive on-time budgets, and I don't think he wants to give that up. So yes, if people are still listening, please send those letters, those emails to your elected representative. I should tell you all, I have, like a number of you, including especially Terry, been in contact with our best connection to all of those various bodies, which would be the Big Five, Jennifer Pyle, many of you know her. I think I have her permission to say she remains somewhat optimistic about the $35 million. And she promises, and of course she has no crystal ball. She doesn't have anybody saying definitively what's going to happen, but there is support for that. I don't know how that's going to turn out. And she, of course, indicated that as soon as she found out, of course, she would let the rest of us know. So there are people in Albany, in the Assembly in particular, that are very supportive of the request that Terry has been making. And let me just say to Terry and his team, kudos. I don't know any superintendent who's gone to Albany as much as Terry has. And we've had quite a few superintendents up in here. And Terry has repeatedly made that effort. And if it turns out that we don't get $35 million, there's not a person on this Brady Bunch screen that could even accuse Terry of not working his you-know-what off to see if he could get as much from Albany. So Terry, we really do appreciate that effort. I think you spent probably as much time in Albany, certainly digitally and certainly in person. And on behalf of the board, we want to thank you for that without regard to how it turns out. And if it turns out that we don't get the $35 million, not that I think that's going to happen, but we will figure out a way, because for our babies, we don't have any choice. So Terry, you correct me if I'm wrong, are you going to be giving an updated presentation? Have you made that request to add that to the agenda on Thursday of the budget, or no?
Just to give a quick analysis, hopefully we'll know by Thursday what our actual school run is based on the governor's finalized budget. So we want to update the board on what our plus delta is. We also want to do some forecasting of what the governor and his team is saying with regards to next year, the potential for quarterly reduction. So our team will provide an update on Thursday with those topics.
All right. So we'll look forward to getting more detail. I know everybody is very anxious to hear how this is going to turn out, but of course we don't know, and I am told we'll know very shortly. All right, if there's no further new business, I need a motion to go into executive session.
Motion.
Hold on a second. A motion to go into executive session for the purposes of discussing the terms and conditions of a particular employee, and also so that folks, our general counsel and his team. I heard Commissioner LeBron make that motion. Is there a second? Somebody help me out here.
Second.
Thank you, Commissioner Adams. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Now, for you folks out there in the digital world, what we'll do is we're going to take a 2 or 3 minute recess, and then we're going to come back with our technology, and it'll exclude everybody who's been faithfully watching this digital platform, and we'll do our business in executive session, which we're required to do under state law, and then we'll reconvene. And if there are any votes to be taken, we'll reconvene in open session. So I guess technically, hey, Tom, can you hear me? Or Marisol, can you respond to this question? Are people able to come see us come back on, or do they have to re-sign back on? How's that work?
So my request is that they
we leave it on.
Breaking up, Marisol.
Take us out.
Marisol, you repeat that again, because at least 2 commissioners, myself included, said you were breaking up.
Let's try again. Can you hear me now?
Mm-hmm. Nope, now you stop. You're frozen.
Okay, so what we're gonna do is ask everybody to click where it says, oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Where?
No.
Yeah.
Okay, click stop video, click mute, and then in 2 minutes, come back on.
All right, thank you very much. Otherwise, good night, everybody.